It was early October, and I needed a break from everything. I'd been working long hours, not sleeping well, and spending too much time in front of screens. I felt like my brain was full of static, like it never got quiet anymore. I didn't want to be around people, traffic, or lights for a few days. I wanted to go somewhere quiet, somewhere out of signal range, just to hit reset. So I decided to go camping alone for 3 nights. I picked a remote section of the Black Elk Wilderness in South Dakota. I'd been there once before, years ago, on a group trip, and remembered how peaceful and empty it felt. I looked at the maps, found a trail that looped about 17 miles through the woods with several streams along the way, and planned to hike the loop slowly, setting up camp wherever it made sense. I brought enough food, water filters, bear spray, and a small satellite beacon for emergencies. I didn't plan on needing help, but I also wasn't trying to be reckless. I drove out on a Thursday morning. The roads got smaller and rougher the farther I went, until I finally parked my car at the little dirt lot near the trailhead. There was only one other car there. The air was cool and dry, and I could smell pine and dead leaves. I had my pack, my boots were broken in, and everything felt right. I locked up, double-checked my gear, and started walking in. The trail was narrow and covered in brown needles and loose rocks. I walked slowly, not in any rush, enjoying the quiet. There were no planes overhead, no buzzing from power lines, no cell service. Just the sound of wind and the crunch of my steps. I hiked about 5 miles that day, past a dry creek bed, and found a nice flat spot in a cluster of trees to set up my tent. I made a small fire, ate some dehydrated rice and beans, and watched the sky go dark through the branches. I slept well that night. The second day was just as peaceful. I got up early, made coffee with my little stove, and walked for several more miles. I passed a few old trail markers, saw some deer, and took a long break near a ridge with a view of the valley. Around mid-afternoon, the trail got steeper and rougher, and I started seeing fewer signs of use. No boot prints, no broken branches, no trash. That wasn't weird, just meant this section wasn't popular. I kind of liked that. I found a clearing near a spring and set up camp there. There were no signs of recent campers. The spot was a bit off the main trail, shielded by rocks and brush. I boiled water, made soup, and sat there listening to the wind slide through the trees. That night, I heard a strange sound, something like a distant knock, 3 or 4 times, and then silence, came from uphill behind my tent. I froze for a second, waited, and listened. Nothing else happened. It didn't sound like an animal, more like wood on wood, but I told myself it could have been anything. A tree shifting, something falling. I had my bear spray and a fixed blade knife by my sleeping bag. I stayed awake for a while, but eventually drifted off. The third day started off cloudy. The sky looked heavy, like rain was coming, so I packed up quickly and moved out. The trail grew thinner and harder to follow. It dipped into dense forest where sunlight barely made it through. Around noon, I noticed something strange. I found what looked like an old hunting blind, a small, rotted wooden structure, just a few feet off the ground with planks missing. It didn't look like it had been used in years. Still, I kept walking. About 2 hours later, I saw something else. A plastic gas can half buried in the dirt, faded and cracked. That was the first piece of man-made trash I'd seen since day one. Something about it made me uneasy. By late afternoon, the wind picked up. I was trying to find a good place to camp, but nothing looked right. The ground was sloped or muddy or full of rocks. I kept walking, maybe farther than I should have, and eventually found a flat spot at the base of a hill. It wasn't ideal, a little too close to a game trail, but I was tired and wanted to stop. I set up my tent, made some food, and tried to relax. That night was different. Just after sunset, I heard the same knocking sound as before. 3 knocks, then a pause, then 2 more. It was closer this time, maybe less than 100 feet uphill. I turned off my headlamp and sat still. My hand was on the bear spray. I listened for footsteps, rustling, anything. But the woods were silent after that. Too silent. No wind, no birds, no insects. Nothing. I didn't sleep much. Every time I started to drift off, I thought I heard movement outside. I kept checking the tent walls for shadows. At some point, I must have fallen asleep, but it wasn't restful. The next morning, I wanted to be out of there as fast as possible. I skipped breakfast, packed fast, and got back on the trail. I had about 6 miles left to complete the loop and reach the trailhead. The weather was gray, the clouds were lower, and the woods felt different, heavier somehow. I walked fast but kept alert. Every time I thought I heard something behind me, I stopped and looked, but nothing was ever there. A few hours later, I reached a split in the trail that wasn't on my map. There were 2 paths. One looked like the trail I'd been following, the other looked newer, more cleared, like someone had cut it recently. The trees along the second path were trimmed, and the brush was pushed to the sides. I knew I should stick with the map and follow the original trail, but curiosity got the better of me. I figured maybe it was a shortcut or a reroute. I took the new trail. That was a mistake. First, it seemed fine. It was easier to walk, flatter and straighter. But after about 20 minutes, the trail narrowed and the trees closed in. I started seeing things that didn't feel right. A pile of empty tin cans near a stump. A torn tarp half covered in leaves. A broken folding chair. All old, all weathered, but not rotted. I smelled something faint, like burnt plastic or oil. I kept walking, feeling more and more uneasy. Then I saw the cabin. It was small, made of rough logs and tar paper, with a rusted metal roof and no windows. The door was slightly open, hanging crooked on its hinges. I stopped cold. There was no sign of anyone, no smoke, no sound, but the place felt wrong. There were deep tire tracks leading away from it, toward a clearing. I looked around and realized the path I'd followed wasn't a trail at all. It was a vehicle track, not on any map. I backed away slowly and turned around. I didn't run, but I moved fast, retracing my steps. I passed the chair, the cans, the tarp. My heart was pounding. I kept checking over my shoulder. The woods were still quiet, too quiet. When I reached the split again, I went back onto the original trail and didn't stop for anything. I walked as fast as I could, only slowing down when my legs started to cramp. 2 hours later, I saw the wooden sign near the trailhead. My car was still there, untouched. The other car was gone. I got in, locked the doors, and sat there for a while, just breathing. Then I drove, faster than I probably should have, down the long gravel road and back toward the highway. I didn't report the cabin. I thought about it, but I didn't know what to say. I hadn't seen anyone, hadn't heard anything clearly threatening. But something about that place stuck with me. I've been camping many times before and since, but I never take unofficial trails now. I always stick to marked paths, always let someone know exactly where I'm going, and I never camp alone more than one night. That third night in the woods changed something in me. The sound of those knocks, the silence afterward, and the things I saw along that hidden track. They weren't accidents. Someone had been out there, maybe still is. And I think if I'd reached that cabin a little later, or if I'd knocked or looked inside, maybe I wouldn't have made it back to the trail. Some things in the woods aren't ghosts or monsters. Some things are worse because they're real. It was a late summer weekend when I decided to go camping alone in the national forest a few hours' drive from my city. I had been wanting to escape for a couple of days, just to be quiet and away from everything. No phone signal, no internet, no people. Just me, my backpack, and the forest. I had done plenty of camping before, so I knew how to prepare, but this trip was different from my usual spots. I picked a less popular area, hoping for more solitude. I arrived in the afternoon, the sun already starting to drop but still warm. The air smelled of pine and dry earth. The trailhead was small, barely marked, with a faded wooden sign leaning slightly to one side. I had the map printed from the Forest Service website, and my compass was handy just in case. My backpack felt heavy but manageable, loaded with a lightweight tent, sleeping bag, stove, food for 2 days, water, and some basic first aid gear. The trail was narrow and winding, the ground covered in dry leaves and small twigs. I stepped carefully, listening to the crunch beneath my boots. Birds called overhead, and a light breeze rustled the branches. The forest was peaceful and quiet in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. I passed a small stream about a mile in and stopped for a quick drink, scooping up cold water with my hands and sipping carefully. I filtered some water with my portable filter and refilled my bottle. After hiking for about 3 miles, I found a small clearing surrounded by tall trees. It was perfect, flat ground, dry, with a good view of the sky above. I set up my tent slowly, staking it firmly into the earth and making sure the rainfly was secure, even though the forecast showed no rain. I laid out my sleeping bag inside and arranged my gear neatly so I could find everything quickly. Once camp was set, I collected some dry wood nearby for a fire later. The forest floor was scattered with small branches and pine cones. I stacked the wood carefully, separating kindling and larger pieces. I knew that starting a fire in the wild was never guaranteed, especially if the wood was damp or the wind shifted. As the sun began to set, the light turned soft and golden, casting long shadows between the trees. I took out my small stove to cook a simple dinner, dehydrated pasta with sauce. It wasn't fancy, but it was enough. I ate slowly, savoring the quiet and the fading light. The forest seemed to settle around me, like a living wall enclosing the space. I cleaned up, packing my trash and leftovers in a sealed bag to avoid attracting animals. I took out my flashlight and headlamp and double-checked the tent zippers. The night was coming fast. Around twilight, I built the fire carefully. Using the dry kindling, I struck my lighter several times until small flames caught. I blew gently on the embers until the fire grew, crackling and sending sparks upward. The warmth felt good, and I sat close, watching the orange glow flicker against the darkening woods. As darkness fully took over, the forest noises changed. The daytime birds stopped calling, replaced by the chirping of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. The wind was calm now, barely moving the leaves. I lay back on my sleeping pad, staring up through the mesh roof of my tent at the stars beginning to appear. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. That's when I started to notice a strange sound. At first, it was faint, almost like a distant rustling. I paused, listening closely. It didn't sound like the usual animal noises I was used to. It was more like someone or something moving carefully through the underbrush, not far from my camp. I tried to shake off the feeling. Maybe it was just a deer or some raccoon searching for food. I reminded myself that I was in the forest, and wild animals were common. But the noise continued, slow, deliberate steps, something breaking small twigs every now and then. It didn't stop. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the tent quietly, aiming the beam around the clearing's edge. The light cut through the darkness, illuminating the trunks of the trees and patches of bushes, but nothing moved. No eyes reflected back, just empty shadows. I felt my heartbeat quicken. My training told me to stay calm and assess the situation logically. Maybe an animal was just nearby, but then I noticed the fire was smaller than before. Maybe the wind had shifted or the flames had died down. I crouched and added a couple of logs, careful not to make too much noise. The rustling sound was still there, closer now. It was definitely footsteps, slow and cautious. The kind of steps someone would make trying not to be heard but still moving steadily toward you. I scanned the area with the flashlight again, shining it into the trees and bushes. No sign of any person, no flashlight beams or voices, just the quiet forest. I thought about calling out, but that felt dangerous. If there was someone there, making noise like that, maybe they were hiding, maybe they didn't want to be found. I slowly backed into the tent, zipped it shut tightly, and turned off my flashlight to avoid drawing attention. Inside the tent, I felt exposed. My heart pounded loudly in my ears. I grabbed my small knife from the side pocket, holding it close just in case. I sat upright and listened. The footsteps stopped. For a few minutes, there was only the crackling fire and the usual night sounds. Then something else caught my attention. A low, steady thump against a tree near my campsite. Not a natural noise. It sounded deliberate, like someone was knocking on the trunk, maybe trying to send a signal. I held my breath, frozen in place. The knocking repeated 3 times, slow and methodical. I didn't know what to do. The rational part of me told me it might be another camper, maybe someone lost or trying to scare me. But the other part feared that it could be someone with bad intentions. I didn't have phone service to call for help, and my emergency beacon was back in my pack outside the tent. I debated whether to leave the tent and confront whoever was out there, but fear kept me still. The knocking stopped. Then, footsteps started again, moving away slowly, retreating into the dark woods. I waited another 20 minutes before daring to unzip the tent and peek outside. The fire had burned low, casting weak light. The clearing was empty, no sign of footprints or anything left behind. I gathered my things quickly and decided to put out the fire completely, scattering the ashes and stomping out any embers. I didn't want to give any clues about my exact location. Sleep was impossible after that. Every noise made me jump. Every crack of a twig sounded like footsteps approaching. I stayed alert, clutching my knife, eyes wide open in the darkness. Eventually, exhaustion took over. I managed a few hours of fitful sleep, waking frequently. The next morning, I packed my camp quietly, avoiding making too much noise. I kept my eyes on the tree line as I broke down the tent and packed my bag. As I hiked back to the trailhead, I noticed something odd. Faint footprints leading from the edge of my camp toward the deeper woods. They were human prints, not animal tracks, and they didn't belong to me. I followed them a little, but they faded after a while, swallowed by the dry leaves and undergrowth. On the drive home, I kept thinking about what had happened, who had been near my camp. Were they just a harmless hiker, or someone watching me for unknown reasons? The feeling of being watched, of not being alone in a place I thought was quiet and safe, stuck with me. The next day, I reported the incident to the forest ranger station. They told me that sometimes people camp illegally or use the forest for activities they shouldn't, but they hadn't had any recent reports in that area. They advised me to always camp near others or in designated sites if I went back. In the end, I realized that the forest is full of unknowns. Even in places that feel peaceful, people can be there for reasons that don't make you feel safe. I decided that I would keep camping because I love the outdoors, but I would be more careful. I'd stick to popular sites, camp with friends, and always let someone know exactly where I'd be. That weekend taught me a lesson about trust and caution. The forest isn't just animals and trees. Sometimes it's people too, and they can be the scariest part. I had been planning the trip for a few weeks. I needed a break from the usual routine and wanted to spend a weekend completely alone. No work emails, no city noise, no people, just the woods. I picked a spot in western Colorado, far from any major road or campground. I found it while scanning topo maps and satellite images, an area where the forest thickened around an old, barely visible fire road that hadn't been maintained in years. I figured it was remote enough to give me the solitude I wanted, but still reachable by foot if I hiked in with my gear. I packed everything carefully: tent, sleeping bag, freeze-dried meals, water filter, first aid kit, bear spray, and a good knife. I double-checked all the weather reports and trail conditions. Everything looked perfect. No rain, mild daytime temperatures, cold but manageable nights. I parked my car in a turnout along a service road early Friday afternoon. From there, I hiked in about 5 miles before veering off the official trail onto the overgrown path I had studied beforehand. The air was crisp and the ground soft with layers of pine needles and decaying leaves. I walked another mile or so before finding a flat spot near a small creek. The water was clear and cold, and the sound of it moving over the rocks was peaceful. I set up camp quickly, pitched the tent, hung a bag with food and toiletries high up in a tree away from where I slept, then gathered some firewood. I sat by the fire as the sun started to drop, eating a simple meal and feeling the stress bleed out of me. It was quiet, just the wind and the creek. No one around for miles, I was sure of it. That first night was uneventful. Cold, but uneventful. I woke up once around 2 a.m. to pee and looked up to see a sky full of stars. I remember standing there in the cold, hearing nothing but the distant gurgle of the creek and a few small branches creaking in the wind. It was peaceful in a way that made everything else in life feel unnecessary. I crawled back into my sleeping bag and fell asleep quickly. The next morning, I made coffee and oatmeal, took a walk up the slope behind the campsite, and explored a bit. The terrain wasn't easy. It was steep and covered in loose dirt, but I managed to get a good view from the ridge. I didn't see any signs of other people.
No firas, no tens, no trash.
That made me feel safer in a way. I wasn't worried about animals. I knew how to keep food stored properly and how to make noise if I needed to avoid surprising anything. But people, especially people too far out from where they should be, were a different kind of problem. Still, everything seemed fine. When I got back down to the tent, I noticed something small. My folding camp chair had been knocked over. I had left it upright near the fire pit, and now it was on its side, a few feet away. I told myself the wind must have picked up while I was hiking. It hadn't been strong enough to knock over branches, but I figured it was possible. I didn't feel worried, just a little curious. I set the chair back upright and kept moving. That afternoon, I fished a little in the creek and caught nothing. I didn't care though. It was more about being in the water and listening to the sounds around me. The birds, the wind, a few squirrels darting through the brush. I collected some more wood, cooked another meal over the fire, and sat back again as the light faded. Around 7:30, I thought I heard something deeper in the woods. It was a quick, sharp crack. Not the slow creak of a tree or the random rustle of a small animal, but something heavier, like a footstep. I stared in that direction for a while but saw nothing. I stood up, waved my arms a little, made some noise. Nothing moved. Still, I didn't like it. I kept the bear spray clipped to my hip for the rest of the evening and built the fire up higher than I had the night before. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Every time I'd start to drift off, I'd hear something. A small snap of a twig, a rustle. Could have been anything, a raccoon, a fox, even a deer. But my brain wouldn't let it go. Around 1:30 in the morning, I sat up and listened for a while. The wind had died down completely. It was so quiet that every little sound felt huge. I stayed like that for maybe 20 minutes, then finally lay back down. In the morning, things felt a little off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, but then I saw that my boots had been moved. I had left them just outside the tent flap, neatly placed side by side. Now they were 6 or 7 feet away, one tipped on its side. I stared at them for a long time, trying to figure out what would do that. An animal wouldn't carry off just boots and leave everything else untouched. I checked the rest of the site. Nothing else had been moved or messed with. My food bag was still hanging in the tree. My gear was untouched. There were no tracks, no obvious signs of anyone being there. But I felt it now, like something wasn't right. The peaceful silence from the day before now felt heavy. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Still, I didn't pack up. I told myself it was paranoia. I'd gone on plenty of solo trips before, and sometimes the mind plays tricks. I decided to go for a long hike up the hill to clear my head. I walked maybe 3 miles uphill, stopping every now and then to look behind me. I didn't see anything, but I never felt alone. By the time I got back, it was around 3 p.m., and my stomach was tight. I wasn't hungry, and I couldn't get warm even though the sun was out. I sat by the creek and tried to relax, but I kept scanning the trees. Every movement of the wind through the leaves made me tense up. When I got back to camp, I found something I hadn't noticed before. About 40 feet from my tent, there was a small piece of twine on the ground. It was old-looking and frayed, and I knew for sure it hadn't been there before. It looked like the kind used for tying up tarps or bundles of wood. I don't bring twine like that on trips. I use paracord, which is tougher and newer. I didn't like it. I picked it up, looked at it, then threw it in the fire pit. I stood there for a while just listening. Still nothing, just that same thick silence. That evening, I decided not to light a fire. I didn't want to draw attention. I ate a cold meal from a packet and sat in the tent with the rain fly off, staring up at the fading sky. I kept the bear spray, the knife, and a flashlight right next to me. I didn't plan on sleeping much. I laid there for hours, barely moving. Around midnight, I started to hear something again. Slow, steady footsteps, not right by the tent but close. Maybe 30 or 40 feet away, circling. They would stop for long stretches, then pick up again. I stayed completely still, heart pounding. I didn't want to call out or make noise. I didn't want to give away that I was awake. I just lay there, eyes wide open, straining to hear more. At some point, maybe an hour later, I heard what sounded like breathing. Just for a moment. Could have been the wind, but it felt too close, too steady, then nothing. I stayed frozen until the first light started to break through the trees. I waited until the sky was completely lit before getting out of the tent. I moved slowly, checking everything. The first thing I noticed was a long, shallow scrape in the dirt about 20 feet from my tent. It looked like someone had dragged something, not deep, but long, curved around the campsite and disappeared into the brush. I followed it for a bit, but it faded quickly on the forest floor. That was it. I packed up everything, fast. I didn't eat. I didn't stop. I loaded my backpack, checked it 3 times and started moving. I didn't follow the same trail out. I cut across a different ridge and looped back to the main trail from a wider angle, trying to avoid walking back the same way I came in. I felt watched the whole time. Every step was heavy. I made it to my car by late morning, locked the doors, and drove nonstop until I hit cell service. I pulled into a gas station and sat there for a long time, just staring out the windshield. I didn't report it. I didn't know what I would have said. No real proof.
No confrontation.
Nothing stolen or damaged. Just small, strange signs. Things moved. Things watched. Maybe it was someone living out there. Maybe they were just curious. Or maybe they didn't like people in their woods. I don't know. But I haven't camped alone since. Not once. I still go hiking, still love the outdoors, but I sleep in my truck now. I park at trailheads. I stick to the known places. I don't bushwhack into the deep forest anymore, not even with friends. Something about that weekend changed how I see the woods. Not as an escape, but as a place where no one can hear you, where things happen quietly and leave no trace. And sometimes I still think about the scrape in the dirt, the twine, the quiet footsteps in the dark. Not loud, not rushed, just steady, patient, waiting. It was mid-October, a few years ago, when I decided to do a solo camping trip. I'd done several before, mostly in the spring or early summer, but this time I wanted to see what fall would feel like deep in the forest. The leaves were changing, the temperatures had started to drop at night, and most people were done camping for the season, which was exactly what I wanted. Quiet, empty woods. I picked a state forest in northern Minnesota. It was a place I'd been once before with a friend, but we'd stayed closer to the trailhead that time. This trip, I planned to go farther in, about 7 miles deep on a not-so-popular trail that looped through thick woods and circled around a small lake. I packed light but smart. Tent, sleeping bag rated for colder temps, food, extra socks, gloves, and my water filtration setup. I had a Garmin satellite messenger, a small folding knife, a headlamp, and a fire starter kit. Nothing fancy. I wasn't trying to be some survivalist, just prepared enough. I told my brother where I was going and when I'd be back, left the car in the small dirt lot near the trailhead, and set off just before noon. The air was cool but dry, perfect for hiking. The forest felt almost hollow in some places, all the leaves rustling softly but no real birdsong or movement. That's how it gets in the fall, like the woods are holding their breath. The first few miles were easy, mostly flat terrain with scattered birch and aspen trees, their leaves already carpeting the ground in bright yellow and orange. Eventually, the trail narrowed and the brush grew thicker. I crossed a couple of wooden footbridges over small creeks and passed through an old logging road that had long since been overtaken by nature. I reached the lake by late afternoon. It was smaller than I remembered from the map, maybe a few hundred feet across, completely still. No wind, no ripples. I found a clearing about 50 feet from the shoreline, mostly level ground, some pine trees surrounding it, and barely any signs that anyone had camped there before. I set up my tent, collected some dry wood, and got a small fire going before dark. The cold crept in faster than I expected once the sun dipped below the trees. That first night was peaceful. I ate some instant rice and tuna, drank filtered lake water, and sat by the fire until I got too cold. I turned in early, zipped myself deep into the sleeping bag, and drifted off listening to the breeze pick up just a bit, the trees creaking faintly in the dark. I woke once during the night, probably around 2 or 3, and stepped outside to pee. The fire had long gone out. The moonlight was so clear I didn't even need a flashlight. The lake reflected the pale white light perfectly. I looked around for a minute, just taking it in. It was quiet, but not in a comforting way. Just dead still. Not even wind. I climbed back in and slept until morning. The next day, I planned to explore a bit farther off the main trail. There was a small ridge on the map just north of the lake. I figured I'd do a loop hike out there and back with my day pack. I left camp set up and took only the essentials: some snacks, a water bottle, my knife, and the GPS unit. The ridge wasn't too far, but the climb was steeper than it looked on the map. Once I got to the top, though, the view was worth it. Miles of tree canopy in all shades of orange, red, and yellow. I stayed up there for an hour or so, eating and resting. The trouble started on my way back down. I took what I thought was the same path down, but slightly to the east. I figured it would reconnect with the trail eventually, and I'd circle back to the lake from another direction. But after 30 minutes, then an hour, I wasn't seeing anything familiar. The trees started to look different, older, thicker. The terrain got soggier, like a marsh was nearby. I checked the GPS, but the signal was weak in that valley, and it kept losing satellite lock. I tried to backtrack, but the woods in that area were dense, and I hadn't left any kind of trail markers. Eventually, the forest floor became harder to walk across. Lots of moss, uneven rocks, and twisted roots. I slipped twice. The second time, I scraped my hand on a sharp stone and bled a little. Around that point, I started to feel watched. I know how that sounds, but it wasn't like I thought someone was there. It was more like the woods themselves felt wrong. I've spent enough time outside to know that silence like that usually means there's a predator nearby. But this was different. I wasn't hearing silence. I was hearing nothing at all. No wind, no rustling leaves. Just the sound of my own breathing and boots. After another 30 minutes of walking, I saw a tree that I remembered. A twisted birch that had been split by lightning. I knew it was close to camp, maybe only 10 minutes out. I felt a flood of relief. But when I got closer, I noticed something that stopped me cold. Around the base of the tree, the earth had been disturbed. Not just some animal digging, but several patches of overturned soil, almost like someone had used a shovel. The dirt was fresh, loose. I looked around, but I didn't see any tools or gear or signs of a person. I didn't touch it. I just moved past quickly, trying to get back to camp. When I got there, something was off. My tent was still there, but the rainfly had been half unzipped. I never leave it like that. My fire pit had been scattered. Rocks pushed out, ashes spread. My food bag was still tied up in the tree where I left it, untouched. Nothing was stolen or broken, but someone had clearly been there. I checked around the area for boot prints, but the thick pine needles made it hard to tell. I did see one thing, though, a small piece of paper stuck under a rock by the edge of the clearing. It was an old receipt from a gas station, completely faded except for a date at the top, 2017, 6 years ago. It made no sense why it would be there. There wasn't even litter anywhere else around. Just that. I didn't feel like staying another night. I packed everything fast and hiked out with less than 2 hours of daylight left. I should have waited until morning, but I didn't want to sleep there again. I moved quickly, using my GPS and headlamp when the light dropped. I slipped again near one of the creeks and got soaked up to my knees, but I didn't care. I wanted out. When I reached the trailhead, my car was still there. Nothing touched. The lot was empty. I sat in the driver's seat for a while before turning the key. My socks were wet, my back hurt, my hands were scraped up, and I couldn't stop thinking about that dug-up dirt under the tree or who had been at my camp. The next day, I filed a report with the park office. Not a police report, just an informal note about possible disturbance at my site. They were polite but not concerned. Said sometimes other campers wander through. They didn't have any record of anyone else checking in at that trail during those days. 2 weeks later, I got a call. The ranger who'd taken my report said they did a walkthrough of the area I described and found what I saw, Disturbed soil under the split birch tree. They had someone from the DNR look at it. Turned out there were old trash bags buried under there. Decomposing clothes, boots, and what looked like camping gear, maybe from years back. He said it might have been someone who got lost or hurt, or even someone who just dumped stuff. Nothing immediately suspicious, but they were going to investigate. I never heard back again after that. Since then, I haven't camped alone. I still go out into the woods, still hike. But every time I do, I keep thinking about how close I came to sleeping another night out there, right near whatever that was under the ground. If I hadn't gotten turned around, I wouldn't have seen it. And if someone came back that night, I don't know what would have happened. I try not to think about it too much, but I do, especially when it's quiet out. Too quiet. It was the first weekend of November, and I had been looking forward to this solo camping trip for weeks. I had just finished a long project at work, and my head was fried. I needed to be somewhere quiet, somewhere far away from traffic and phones and people talking. The weather was cooling down, but not yet freezing. The leaves were still clinging to the trees in deep reds and rust orange, and I wanted to catch that last bit of fall before everything went gray. I picked a remote section of national forest in western North Carolina, close to the Tennessee border. I had never camped there before, but I had read about it online. It wasn't a well-known spot, which was exactly what I wanted. I packed everything the night before: tent, sleeping bag, pad, food, water filter, extra socks, 2 knives, a fire starter, my small camp stove, and my little blue gas canister. I brought 2 full Nalgene bottles and a backup water bag, plus a laminated map I printed from a hiking website. The plan was to hike about 4 miles into the woods, find a flat clearing near the creek I saw on the topo map, and set up camp for 2 nights. I had no signal there, but I told my brother where I was going, sent him the GPS pin, and we had a rule. If he didn't hear from me by Sunday night, he'd call the local sheriff's office. It was a good safety net, though I never expected to need it. The drive out there took almost 4 hours. The last 40 minutes were along winding dirt roads. The forest was beautiful, thick with pine and maple, and the air smelled like wood smoke and wet leaves. I parked at the edge of a wide turnout just off a rough gravel road, packed my things, and crossed a metal gate that marked the trailhead. From there, I followed an unmarked trail that looked more like an old logging road, partly overgrown but still walkable. It climbed steadily, weaving through the trees, then dropped down into a valley. The forest got quieter as I walked in. No more engine sounds, no more wind from cars, just the steady rhythm of my boots hitting soft dirt, the occasional bird flitting through the branches above, and once, the scurry of something small, probably a chipmunk, through the underbrush. I passed a few muddy animal tracks near the stream. Deer, I figured. Nothing to worry about. It took me a little longer than expected to find a good spot to set up. I wanted to be near the water but not too close. Mosquitoes, damp ground, and in case it rained, I didn't want runoff flooding my tent. I eventually found a dry, level patch about 15 yards uphill from the creek. It was just wide enough for my 2-person tent, surrounded by young trees and low brush. It felt secluded, but not claustrophobic. I could still see the sky through the gaps in the canopy above. Setting up was routine. I laid out my footprint, staked the tent, inflated my sleeping pad, unrolled my bag, and put all my scented stuff, food, trash, toothpaste, into a dry bag. I strung it up between 2 trees a good distance from the tent, following bare safety basics. Then I walked down to the creek and filled my filter bag. The water was cold and clear, and the sound of it running over the rocks was steady and calming. I boiled water on my little stove, poured it into a freeze-dried meal pouch, and let it sit while I warmed my hands near the flame. After dinner, I gathered some dry twigs and small branches for a fire. It took a little work to get it going, but once it caught, I sat back against a log and watched the flames for a long time. I didn't have my phone, didn't bring a book, didn't need either. That first night was quiet. Nothing strange, just the usual sounds. Wind in the trees, a few rustles from small animals, the crackle of the fire. I crawled into my tent around 9:30, zipped up, and drifted off. I woke once in the night, maybe around 2 a.m. I wasn't sure what stirred me. Maybe a sound, maybe just being cold. I sat up and listened. There was nothing, just the creek, far off and steady. I lay back down and eventually fell asleep again. The next morning, I got up with the light. It was chilly, maybe mid-40s, and my breath fogged the air. I made coffee, ate an energy bar, and took a slow walk along the creek with my small day pack. I didn't go far, just about a mile upstream, then looped back around. On my way back, I noticed something odd. A broken sapling, maybe shoulder high, snapped clean in the middle. That wasn't unusual on its own. But what caught my eye was that the break wasn't clean like from snow weight or old rot. It looked fresh. The wood was pale and splintered, and I saw faint scuff marks in the dirt nearby. Could have been from a deer, I told myself. Maybe it bolted and caught the tree with its shoulder or antlers. Still, something about the way it was broken stuck with me. Back at camp, I boiled water again and ate a second meal around noon. Then I spent the early afternoon sitting by the creek and sketching in a little notebook I kept in my pack. Time passed slowly, and I liked that.
No deadlines, no emails.
Just sun through the trees and the constant sound of the water. That evening, I had a fire again, though smaller this time. I didn't feel like staying up late. Something felt different as it got dark. Hard to explain. The air seemed heavier. It wasn't just the temperature, though it dropped fast after sunset. It was like the forest got quieter. Fewer birds. No wind. Just stillness. I kept looking into the trees, even though I didn't hear anything. I slept badly that second night. I kept waking up, sometimes with a jolt like I'd heard something but wasn't sure. I unzipped the tent partway once and looked out with my headlamp. Nothing. No eye shine, no movement, not even a breeze in the trees. Just darkness. I closed the flap and lay there with the light off, staring into nothing, trying to listen past the sound of my heartbeat. Around 4 a.m., I heard it, definitely this time. It wasn't loud, but it was real. A soft, deliberate crunch, like a boot on dry leaves. It wasn't an animal. Animals move differently. They scurry or dash. This was slow. One step, then stillness, then another. My whole body tensed up. I didn't move, didn't even breathe for a few seconds. My heart was hammering. I waited. Another step, closer this time, then silence again. I reached slowly for the knife I kept next to me in the tent. I didn't open it, just held it. I lay there for what felt like an hour, listening. Nothing else came. No more steps. No zip from the bear bag. No voice. Just silence. I must have dozed off again near dawn, but it was restless and full of shallow dreams. I woke around 7:30. It was cold, and everything was damp. I sat up slowly and listened. Nothing unusual, just birds. I unzipped the tent, stepped outside, and looked around. Nothing seemed disturbed. I checked my food bag, still there, untouched. I looked at the ground around camp, but there were too many leaves to see clear prints. I packed up slowly that morning. I was supposed to stay a second full day and night, but something felt off. I told myself I was just being paranoid, but the tight feeling in my chest wouldn't go away. I packed everything, made sure the fire was cold and scattered, and started back toward the car. About 20 minutes into the hike back, I noticed something again. Another broken sapling. Same kind of break. Fresh. Maybe 30 feet off the trail. I stopped and looked at it, then scanned the woods around it. Nothing moved. I picked up my pace after that. I didn't calm down until I saw the metal gate at the trailhead. I crossed it, got in the car, locked the doors, and sat there for a minute with the engine off. I listened, not for anything specific, just listened. It was still quiet. I started the car and drove. The next day, I was back home and couldn't shake the unease. I kept thinking about those broken trees. I decided to check some hunting forums, just to see if maybe someone else had posted about strange things in that part of the forest. That's when I saw a thread about illegal grow operations hidden in national forests, weed mostly, sometimes meth labs. They're usually well hidden, off-trail, and often guarded. Some of the posts said you could sometimes spot them by broken branches or trails that weren't made by animals. that hit me harder than I expected. I thought about the slow, heavy footsteps outside my tent. Someone was probably checking me out, deciding whether I was a threat, maybe watching to see if I found something I shouldn't. Maybe they'd been camped nearby the whole time. I never went back to that spot. I never reported it either. I didn't want to get involved. But I think about it sometimes, how close I might have been to something I wasn't supposed to see, and how lucky I was that they must have decided I wasn't a problem. I still go camping, but I don't go that deep alone anymore. And I pay more attention now, not just to the trail and the weather, but to the quiet things, the broken trees, the missing birds, the weight in the air that tells you something's off before you even know why. I listen to that feeling now, because it might be the only warning you get. I went camping alone last October in the Sawtooth Mountains of Idaho. I'd been up there a few times before with friends and twice by myself, so I was familiar with the trails and layout. The reason I chose that weekend was because most of the tourists had already stopped coming for the season. The air was crisp and cold, and the leaves had already turned orange and red. I wanted peace and quiet, some time to disconnect and think. I parked at a trailhead that wasn't very popular, one of the less marked ones. It was about 4 hours from the nearest gas station, and I only saw one other car at the lot. I wasn't too worried. I had checked the weather, packed warm gear, bear spray, a GPS beacon, my phone, backup batteries, a water filter, stove, dehydrated meals, a first aid kit, and plenty of warm layers. I also had a solid tent and a cold-rated sleeping bag. I'd done solo camping before, and I knew how to avoid doing anything stupid. The plan was to hike about 7 miles to an alpine lake, camp there for 2 nights, and then hike out the same way. The trail started off smooth and wide but quickly narrowed as it curved through thick pine forest. The elevation gain was steady but not brutal. After the first hour, the forest got denser. The trees were tall and packed tightly together, casting long shadows even though it was still early afternoon. The air smelled like sap and cold earth. I noticed pretty quickly that it was quieter than usual. Normally, I'd hear birds or squirrels or the occasional rustle of branches, but this time the woods felt still. Not completely silent, just still. It didn't feel dangerous at first. More like the kind of quiet you get when snow is coming or when you're far away from roads or people. It was peaceful for the most part, but a little heavy too. About 4 miles in, I stopped for water by a creek that crossed the trail. I filtered a liter and drank most of it there, then filled up again. While I sat on a rock, I looked around and noticed a few trees had deep cuts in the bark. Old, maybe made by elk or someone with a hatchet. The marks didn't look fresh. I didn't think much of it. When I finally got to the lake, it was almost 5 in the evening. The sun was starting to drop behind the ridge, and the temperature was falling fast. The lake itself was beautiful, tucked in a bowl surrounded by steep, rocky slopes with patches of snow still clinging to the shadowed sides. The water was so clear I could see down to the bottom near the shore. I found a decent spot slightly uphill from the water, tucked behind some trees and rocks for shelter from the wind. I set up my tent, unpacked my food, and got a small fire going with what I gathered nearby. I heated up some water and made dinner. As I ate, I looked out across the lake. There were no other tents, no fires, no movement at all. That night, the wind picked up. I'd staked the tent well, and I had guy lines out, so I wasn't too worried about it. I crawled into my bag and tried to sleep, but the wind kept making this snapping noise as it pushed the fly against the poles. I drifted in and out, not deeply asleep, but resting. At some point in the night, I heard a loud snap outside, like a branch breaking close by. I froze and listened. For a minute, I didn't hear anything else. I reminded myself that animals break branches all the time, probably a deer or a porcupine. Still, I grabbed my bear spray and kept it close. I stayed awake for maybe an hour, heart racing, before falling asleep again. In the morning, I got up early. It was cold, maybe below freezing. I could see my breath. There was frost on the tent. I boiled water for coffee and oatmeal and took a walk around the lake after eating. The ground was a mix of pine needles, rocks, and frozen mud. I took a few photos with my phone, then hiked a short distance up one of the side trails to see a better view of the lake from above. When I got back to my camp, I noticed something weird. A rock about the size of a football that I'd used to weigh down part of my rainfly was moved. Not just tipped over, moved a good 2 feet from where I left it. That didn't happen from wind. It had been wedged between other rocks. I looked around but didn't see any tracks. The ground was too dry and rocky. I convinced myself I'd maybe moved it and forgotten. Or maybe some animal nosed it over in the night. But it still bugged me. I went on with my day, hiked a bit more, read a book in the sun, ate lunch, and then napped for a while in the tent. That evening, I made a small fire again, cooked dinner, and sat watching the flames while the sky turned dark. It was quiet again, that kind of quiet that feels thick, like something's pressing on your ears. I kept turning around and scanning the woods, not sure what I was expecting. Nothing moved. I didn't see any eyes reflecting the firelight. That night was worse. The wind died down, which should have helped me sleep, but I couldn't get comfortable. Around 2 in the morning, I heard what I thought was soft crunching, like footsteps on pine needles and frozen ground. I held my breath and stayed perfectly still, listening. The sound wasn't loud, but it was steady. Slow, careful steps. I thought maybe it was an animal, but animals usually don't move like that. Not that slow, not with pauses between each step. I laid there with my heart hammering in my chest, gripping the bear spray with one hand and a knife in the other. The steps circled around the tent at a distance, then stopped. I waited. Nothing. Total silence again. Eventually, I fell asleep out of exhaustion. I woke up at first light, stiff and groggy. When I stepped outside the tent, I saw more signs that someone had been there. A few rocks that had been undisturbed were now turned over. Pine cones had been gathered in a pile near the fire pit that had not been there before. It looked deliberate. I stood there staring at it, stomach in knots. This was too weird now to ignore. Even if someone had just been messing around, it meant there was a person walking around my camp in the middle of the night. A person who didn't say anything, didn't announce themselves, didn't light a fire or set up a tent, just watched and moved things. I packed up right away. No breakfast, no coffee. I stuffed everything into my pack as fast as I could. I kept bear spray in my pocket and my knife clipped to my hip. I kept scanning the trees, expecting to see someone standing behind a trunk watching me, but there was nothing. The hike back was tense. I took fewer breaks, stopped only once to drink water, and kept checking behind me. Every little sound made me freeze and listen. Once I saw a flash of movement through the trees up on a ridge to my right. Just a shape, brown or dark green, ducking behind rocks. Could have been anything, but it made me walk faster. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps behind me on the trail, but when I stopped and turned, there was nothing there. No one. I didn't start to feel better until I was within a mile of the trailhead. I started to hear birds again, which was strange, like the forest was letting out a breath. When I reached the parking area, my heart dropped. My car was the only one there, but something was wrong. The driver's side door wasn't shut all the way. It was cracked open just slightly, like someone had pulled it but not latched it. I never leave it like that. I always double-check my doors. Always. I walked around the car, checking for damage or signs of a break-in. Nothing was smashed, but when I got in, I saw the glove box had been opened. Not rifled through, just opened. A pack of gum that I usually kept there was sitting on the passenger seat. Nothing was taken. Not the jumper cables, not the emergency cash I kept in a side panel, not even the phone charger. I got in, locked the doors, and started the engine. I drove straight back to town without stopping. The whole way, I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting a car to follow me. But there was no one. Back home, I emptied my pack, checked all my gear. Everything was there. Nothing stolen. But it didn't make me feel better. I barely slept that night. Every time the house creaked, I jolted awake. I kept imagining someone had followed me home, that they were outside, watching. For weeks after, I thought about what happened. I kept telling myself it was just a random person messing around. Maybe a hunter who didn't want to be seen. Maybe someone camping nearby who thought it would be funny to sneak around. But that didn't explain the way they moved. The slow, quiet steps, the deliberate shifting of rocks and cones, the silence. I reported it anonymously to the Forest Service. Told them there might be someone tampering with cars or walking around camps at night. They logged it but didn't seem too concerned. I haven't gone back there since. I still go camping, but never alone now. Not in places that remote. And I always check around my tent at night, walk the perimeter. I take a motion detector light now and place it outside my tent. It wasn't the wilderness that scared me. It was the idea that someone was out there, walking around in the dark, not announcing themselves, not stealing, not hurting, just watching, moving things, circling, and slipping away without a sound. That kind of person is way worse than any animal or ghost story, because they're real, and they know how to stay hidden. It was early September when I decided to do a solo weekend camping trip in Central Oregon. I had been working long hours, barely sleeping, always on a screen, and I felt like my head was filled with static. I didn't want to talk to anyone. I didn't want to check my phone. I just wanted to be alone in the woods for a couple of nights with some quiet. I chose a lesser-known area just east of the Cascades. I had seen it mentioned once in a backcountry forum, and from what I could gather, it wasn't very trafficked. It wasn't part of a national park or a major trail system, just a small Forest Service road leading into scattered public land, mostly used by hunters and the occasional fly fishermen. Sounded perfect. I planned to hike in about 4 miles from my car, set up camp near a small creek, and stay there until Sunday afternoon. I left Portland early Friday morning, stopped once for gas and some last-minute snacks, and reached the forest road just before noon. It was a long, washboard stretch of dirt that narrowed into deep brush in places. I had to slow to a crawl several times. I had an older SUV, not lifted or anything special, and I could feel rocks and sticks pinging off the undercarriage as I eased forward. There were a couple of spots where I had to back up and try again because the road forked in ways that weren't on any GPS or printed map. After maybe 40 minutes of cautious driving, I pulled off at a wide clearing where the brush thinned out and a faint boot trail disappeared into the woods. I parked facing out so I wouldn't have to turn around later and took a picture of my car with the surrounding trees, just in case something happened. I always did that when I camped solo. I checked my pack one more time before locking the car, tent, food, bear canister, water filter, first aid, knife, headlamp, dry layers, rain gear. Everything was good. I slid the pack on and started following the trail. It was dry and warm out, but not hot. The trees here were mostly pine, spaced out enough that sunlight got through and made everything feel open and bright. After about a mile, I lost the trail completely. It just faded into tall grass and lichen-covered rocks. I wasn't worried. I had the creek as my destination, and I could already hear it faintly through the trees. I pulled out my compass and turned east, weaving around deadfall and brush. About 2 hours in, I found the stream. It wasn't much more than a narrow trickle lined with moss and small stones, but the water was moving and clear. I followed it upstream for another half-mile until I found a flat patch of dry ground surrounded by a natural ring of trees and boulders. Felt sheltered, quiet. I dropped my pack and just stood there for a second, breathing in the piney air and listening to the gentle splash of water nearby. I took my time setting up camp. The tent went up easily on soft, packed dirt. I set the bear canister a good distance away, wedged between 2 roots under a small ledge. I filtered some water, ate a granola bar, then walked around the area for a bit to get my bearings. There were no fire rings, no old trash, no signs anyone had been here in a long time. That's what I wanted, true quiet. I gathered a small pile of dry wood just in case it got cold and made a mental note of where the dead trees were, in case I needed more. I didn't do much else that afternoon. I sat on a flat rock by the creek and read a paperback I'd brought, then walked barefoot in the cold water until my feet went numb. By the time the sun started to dip below the trees, I felt more relaxed than I had in weeks. The woods had that warm glow they get just before nightfall, orange streaks across the trunks, long shadows moving slowly with the wind. That night, I didn't even make a fire. I climbed into my sleeping bag with just a headlamp and the sound of water to keep me company. I slept deeply and didn't wake once until morning. The next day, Saturday, I woke up with the sun. It was colder than I expected, and the outside of the tent was damp with condensation. I boiled water for coffee and oatmeal, took a short hike along the creek, and spent most of the day resting and enjoying the quiet. I saw a couple of deer, a few squirrels, and a hawk overhead, but no people. Not even distant voices or the hum of ATVs. It felt like I was completely alone out there. Late in the afternoon, I started to get an odd feeling. It wasn't sudden or dramatic, more like something subtle had shifted. I noticed it while sitting on a rock with my feet in the water again. The breeze had died down, and the air felt heavier somehow. The forest wasn't as quiet. I could hear more birds than before, but they weren't singing, just sharp, quick calls like warnings. I brushed it off and made myself a hot meal. After eating, I walked a bit further upstream and noticed a narrow game trail leading up a steep hill. I didn't follow it far, just far enough to see that it crested on a small ridge, probably giving a decent view of the forest below. I marked the spot with a stick and headed back. That night, I made a small fire. I wasn't cold, but I wanted the comfort of light. I didn't feel scared exactly, but that uneasy feeling lingered. I kept glancing over my shoulder more than usual. I moved the bare canister a little further away. I didn't hear anything out of place, but I felt like something was off. I doused the fire completely before turning in. I sat inside my tent for a while, just listening. The normal night sounds were there. Crickets, wind through the trees, the stream. But I kept thinking I heard something else underneath all that. Something lighter, like footfalls on soft dirt. I told myself it was probably a raccoon or deer. I put in my earplugs and lay down. I woke up sometime after midnight, heart racing. I didn't know why at first. There was no sound, no light, nothing moving. But I knew something had pulled me out of sleep. I slowly sat up and pulled out one earplug. Everything was quiet. I unzipped the tent as slowly as I could and peeked outside. My fire pit was dark, the trees were still, and the moon was bright enough that I could see across the clearing. That's when I noticed the bare canister was gone. I had wedged it tight between the roots of a downed tree under the ledge, and now it was completely gone. I stood up, still in socks, and walked to where I had put it. The ground was disturbed, scuffed dirt, a few deep impressions like something heavy had been dragged. I followed the marks for about 10 feet before they disappeared into grass. At first I thought it might have been a bear, but the area was dry, and I couldn't find claw marks, tracks, or anything. And there was no noise. Nothing had sniffed around my tent, knocked anything over, or made any mess. It was like someone had just come in and taken it. I stood there in the dark for a long time, just listening. I was alert now, wide awake, but there was nothing to react to. After a while, I went back into the tent and sat with the knife in my lap. I didn't sleep again. At sunrise, I packed up quickly. I had one day's worth of food in my day pack and a water filter, so I decided I'd just hike back to the car and go home early. The peacefulness of the trip was gone. But as I made my way back toward the trail, or what had once been the trail, I realized something wasn't right. I'd been walking for over an hour, using my compass and sun to keep direction, but I hadn't come across any of the landmarks I remembered. Not the patch of white rock, not the dead tree with the split trunk, nothing. I checked the GPS on my phone, but there was no signal, not even enough for a position. I kept walking, thinking maybe I just drifted a little too far north, but the terrain didn't match. I didn't recognize any of it. By noon, I had to admit I was lost. I stopped by the creek again to refill my bottle and rest. That's when I noticed the first boot print. It wasn't mine. I wore wide hiking shoes with a specific tread, and this was narrower, more defined, and slightly longer. It was recent, too. The edge was clean, not weathered or collapsed. It led uphill toward a rocky incline. I stood there a long time, just staring at it. I didn't follow it. I decided to turn directly west and just bushwhack toward where the forest road had been. Even if I couldn't find my car, I could eventually hit the road and follow it back. But after 2 more hours, I hadn't found it. I hadn't found anything. Just more trees, more brush, more uneven ground. Then I heard something behind me. It wasn't loud, just a sharp snap like a branch underfoot. I froze and waited, listening hard. Nothing followed. I turned around slowly and scanned the woods. There was no movement. I kept walking. Over the next 20 minutes, I heard it again, twice. Each time it was a single sound, one step, one crack. Not fast, not close, but not far either. Felt like I was being shadowed. I changed direction again, turned north this time, and started moving quicker. I didn't stop to check my compass or rest. I just kept going. The trees got denser, the brush thicker. My pack snagged on branches, and my shins got scratched. I started to sweat, and the sun dipped lower behind the hills. Then I found the canister. It was lying sideways in a small depression, almost hidden under brush. The lid was still on. Nothing inside had been touched. It was like it had been placed there. I backed away slowly, heart pounding. I dropped my pack right there, took just my knife and water, and started. I left home just after 6 a.m., packed and ready, with everything I thought I'd need for 2 nights alone in the woods. I had a map, a compass, a fully charged power bank, a paper guidebook of the area, and enough food and water to last me more than twice the planned time. I had 2 knives, a hatchet, a small camp stove, and a solar lantern. My tent was new, only used twice before, and I had a good sleeping bag rated well below the nighttime temperatures I expected. This was something I had wanted to do for a while. A solo hike and camp through a less traveled area of a national forest in Central Oregon. It was a weekday in late October, which meant very few people would be around. The weather had started to turn, and I'd picked a trail I knew wouldn't be popular this time of year. I liked it that way. I wasn't going for the views or to meet anyone. I was going because I needed to be by myself, to unplug from everything. No notifications, no voices, no sounds except the wind and trees and the soft crunch of leaves under my boots. I parked my car near a dirt service road off the main forest access and locked everything up tight. The area was remote, but I still didn't want to leave anything easy for a thief. I took the trailhead just past the roadblock gate and began the hike. The morning was chilly but calm. The air was damp from rain the day before, and the smell of wet bark and moss was strong. I hiked for several miles before I even stopped to rest. The forest around me felt peaceful. It was mostly pine and fir, but with some dry underbrush and rocky areas. No cell service out here, which was expected. Around early afternoon, I found the spot I had marked on my map. Flat ground near a small stream, far enough from the trail that I'd be alone, but close enough that I wouldn't get lost trying to find my way back. I cleared a bit of the area for my tent, removed the twigs and rocks, then set everything up slowly and methodically. I've always liked that part of camping, turning an empty patch of woods into a small, temporary home. Tent up, stakes driven, rainfly secured. I gathered dead wood for a fire later and set up my little cook stove on a dry log. Everything was going smoothly. By 5 p.m., the sun was already low and orange through the trees. I had eaten some dehydrated chili and filtered water from the stream. I didn't start a fire that night because I didn't need one, and I was trying to keep a low profile. Fires draw attention, and even though I doubted anyone else was nearby, I preferred to stay unnoticed. I spent the last hour of light reading through my trail guide and checking the topography of the area. There were some older, unofficial logging trails nearby, long overgrown and not on most modern maps. I made a mental note of that. It was fully dark by 6:45. I got into my tent, zipped it up, and settled in. No music, no phone, just a small LED lantern casting soft yellow light inside. I lay back, listening to the rustle of leaves in the wind, a few distant creaks from trees shifting, and the steady flow of the stream nearby. It was quiet enough to hear my own heartbeat. I fell asleep quickly and stayed asleep until just past 1 a.m., when I woke up with a sharp jolt. First, I didn't know why. My heart was racing like it had been triggered by something, but I hadn't heard anything in my sleep. I sat up, rubbed my eyes, and turned off the lantern to listen. Nothing but the wind. Maybe a dream, I thought. I laid back down, eyes open, staring at the roof of the tent. That's when I heard it. A dry, deliberate crack of a stick somewhere out in the woods, maybe 50 or 60 feet from me. Not an animal. Not the kind of random snapping that happens when branches fall or wind gusts. This was paced. I waited, then another crack, then silence. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe loudly. I kept still in my bag, straining to listen. There was nothing for a minute. Then, off to the side, a soft rustling through the leaves. Not heavy, not running, just moving. Someone or something was walking slowly through the brush. I turned the lantern on its lowest setting and kept it pointed at the tent wall. I didn't unzip anything. I didn't make a sound. The movement came and went for another 10 or 15 minutes. Always distant, always shifting direction slightly. At one point, it stopped for a long time. I stayed perfectly still. I told myself it could be a deer, a raccoon, even a bear, but it wasn't. The sounds were light, even too controlled, and they circled. Not once, several times. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Eventually, around 4 a.m., everything went quiet again. Not just quiet, completely still. The air seemed frozen, the wind gone, the stream no longer as loud. I waited until dawn to unzip the tent. When I finally stepped out into the weak morning light, the forest looked just as it had the day before. No tracks, no signs, but I knew something had been out there. I made breakfast, packed everything up, and hiked a mile further into the forest, just to put distance between myself and that spot. I found another clearing higher on the ridge and set up camp again, this time closer to a granite outcrop that offered some elevation and a clearer line of sight. That second day was normal. I didn't see anyone. I didn't hear anything unusual. I stayed close to the camp and made a fire before dusk. As night fell, the temperature dropped fast. I bundled up and sat near the fire for a long time, letting the heat soak into my jacket and gloves. The flames danced against the trees. Nothing moved beyond the edge of the firelight, but I kept scanning. That night, I stayed up later. I didn't want to sleep early again. Around 11 p.m., with the fire burned down to embers, I got into the tent and zipped myself in tight. I left my headlamp next to me and kept the knife closer this time. I didn't hear anything for hours. The forest was normal again. Light breezes, small rustles here and there, the occasional snap of frost forming. But then, just before 3 a.m., something changed. I didn't hear footsteps this time. I didn't hear anything obvious. I just felt it, that sensation of being watched, like eyes were fixed on the back of your neck. I turned on the headlamp and shined it at the wall of the tent. Nothing. I clicked it off and listened. The silence was too perfect again. That same stillness from the night before. No wind, no stream, no sounds. A long time passed. I don't know how long, but it felt like forever. Then, just outside the tent, I heard breathing. Shallow, slow, a human breath. I stopped mine to be sure I wasn't confusing it with my own. There was no mistaking it. It was just outside the tent wall, maybe 2 or 3 feet away. I held still and clenched the knife. The breathing stayed for a minute or more, then moved slowly around to the back of the tent. Then silence again. I didn't unzip it. I didn't move. My whole body was stiff, tense. Eventually, as dawn approached, the regular sounds of the forest returned. Birds chirped. The wind picked up. The stream bubbled. That's when I opened the tent. There were footprints in the dirt. Not boot prints, not hiking shoes, bare feet, human-sized. One set, walking carefully around my tent, then disappearing into the brush downhill. I packed up in under 15 minutes and left. I didn't eat. I didn't check the map. I just started hiking toward the nearest road. The trail was hard to follow at times, but I had enough experience to stick with it. About an hour into the hike, I realized something that made my stomach drop. There was no dew on the trail behind me. Someone had walked it recently, someone barefoot. I stopped and looked behind me. Nothing, no movement, but the feeling of being followed was overwhelming. I kept moving, no breaks, just water and pacing. I didn't even notice when my legs started cramping. I just kept going. Sometime close to noon, I came out onto a gravel road and followed it for 2 more miles until I reached my car. Everything was just as I'd left it. No broken windows, no signs of tampering. But when I opened the back hatch to toss in my gear, I noticed something strange. The emergency kit I kept in a side compartment had been opened and half the contents removed. Only the flashlight and bandages were missing. I hadn't opened it on the trip. I knew that for sure. The compartment cover had been snapped off. I hadn't even thought to lock the inside hatch before I left. I didn't report anything. I didn't tell anyone. Who would I tell? There was no crime, no damage, no evidence. Just a few odd sounds in the night and some footprints. That's all it would be on paper. But I know what I felt out there. I know someone was watching. Someone barefoot, walking silently, deliberately. Someone who didn't want to be seen, but wanted me to know they were there. I haven't camped alone since then. Not once. Not because I'm afraid of the woods. I still love the quiet, the wind through the trees, the smell of pine. But I've learned something out there, something that stays with me. No matter how deep you go, how remote the place is, you're never truly... I had been planning the trip for a couple of months. Work had been rough and I needed a break from everything. My phone, emails, city traffic, just people in general. I wanted to be out there alone for a while. I've always found the quiet of nature more comforting than being around crowds, and I was experienced enough to handle myself solo in the woods. I wasn't reckless about it. I picked a place that wasn't totally remote but far enough off the usual routes that I could be by myself. It was a national forest area in Kentucky I had never been to before, not a popular one. I found it while scrolling through some forums and reading about lesser-known camping spots. One post mentioned a lake deep in the forest, not marked on most maps, reachable only by hiking about 7 miles in on a poorly maintained trail. That sounded perfect. I drove out there on a Thursday morning in early October. The air was already changing, and the trees were starting to turn. I knew there wouldn't be many people around midweek. I brought my heavier gear since the temperature was supposed to drop into the low 40s at night. I packed food for 4 days, plenty of water, a decent GPS, and a satellite beacon I always carry just in case. My pack was a bit heavy, but I liked the feel of it. It grounded me. I got to the parking area just after noon. There was one other car there, an old blue truck with a cracked back window, but I didn't think much of it. Could have been anyone, another hiker, maybe a hunter. This public land. I got on the trail and hiked for most of the afternoon. The trail was barely visible in places. Fallen branches and thick undergrowth made it clear that this path hadn't seen maintenance in years. I liked that. I followed the track carefully using my GPS and landmarks. Eventually I started to hear running water, and the trees opened slightly as I got closer to the lake. It wasn't huge, more like a large pond, but it was beautiful. Clear, cold water with a still surface that reflected the trees like glass. I set up camp on a small ridge just above the edge of the lake. It was a perfect spot. Flat ground, decent cover, good view of the water. I got my tent pitched and collected some deadfall for a fire. There was plenty of dry wood around. I built a small fire ring with stones and got it going just before dusk. The night came fast. With the trees all around and the overcast sky, it got dark quicker than I expected. I had my headlamp on and sat by the fire, eating a packed meal and enjoying the silence. No wind, no bugs, no sound except the occasional pop from the fire. I was happy. This is exactly what I needed. The first night went smooth. I slept warm inside my bag, tucked into the tent, and woke up early. I made coffee and walked down to the lake to rinse my face. The water was cold but clean. I spent the day exploring around the lake, not straying too far from camp but walking slow, stopping often, just taking it all in. I didn't see or hear another person all day. It was everything I had hoped for. Around late afternoon, I noticed some broken branches down near the opposite side of the lake, near the trees. They looked fresh, like someone or something had come through. I crouched and looked closer. It was hard to tell if it was just a deer trail or something else. There were no clear footprints, just a rough disturbance in the brush. I didn't think much of it at the time. Animals move through these places all the time. That second night, I was by the fire again when I heard something. Sticks cracking, not close but not far either, off in the trees past my line of sight. I turned off my headlamp and sat still. The firelight didn't stretch that far, but my ears adjusted quickly. The sound came in bursts, like someone walking slowly but not trying too hard to stay quiet. I assumed it was a deer or maybe a bear, but the footsteps didn't sound heavy. They had a strange rhythm to them. I picked up my flashlight and shined it into the woods, sweeping back and forth. Nothing. I didn't hear anything after that. Still, it put me on edge a bit. I threw a few bigger logs on the fire and stayed up a little later before turning in. I made sure my bear bag was hung high and far, my food sealed, and my gear packed up properly. The next morning, I walked over to where I thought the noise had come from. I found more broken sticks, slightly deeper into the woods from where I had looked the day before. Some low brush was pushed down, but again, nothing clear. I figured maybe it was just a deer bedding down or moving through at night. It's always hard to tell. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It wasn't fear exactly, more like a pressure in the back of my mind that kept tapping me. I tried to ignore it and enjoy the morning. Around midday, I decided to hike up a small ridge to the west of the lake. I left camp mostly packed up, just in case I decided to move locations. The ridge wasn't far, maybe a 20-minute climb. At the top, I got a better view of the surrounding area. The forest stretched out in all directions, thick and undisturbed. I spotted what looked like another body of water maybe half a mile away. It was hard to tell with the trees in the way, but I marked it on my GPS. As I turned to head back, I spotted something strange. Near the base of a tree, a couple 100 feet down the slope, there was what looked like a blue tarp. It was bunched up and barely visible through the branches. It didn't fit the rest of the scene. I hesitated for a few seconds, then made my way toward it. The slope was steep, and I moved slow. As I got closer, I saw it wasn't a tarp. It was an old tent, collapsed and torn, barely upright. The color had faded, and parts of it were rotting. Next to it was a rusted camp stove and what looked like a torn sleeping bag. No gear, no trash, no signs of a recent presence. It looked like someone had camped here years ago and just left everything behind. But there were no burn marks from a fire, no footprints in the dirt, not even animal scat. It didn't look disturbed, just abandoned. The weirdest part was that the tent zipper was fully open, but the interior looked like it had been untouched, flattened, empty, but oddly neat. I didn't stay long. I took a few photos on my phone and hiked back to my camp. The light was starting to fade earlier that day. Clouds were rolling in, and I knew rain might come. I gathered extra wood and covered some under a small overhang of rock in case I needed dry fuel later. That night, I built the fire earlier than usual. I sat closer to it, listening to the woods more than I had before. The forest was quiet, too quiet. I didn't hear a single bird or insect, just wind moving through the trees now and then. Later that night, just before I was about to head into the tent, I heard movement again. This time it was closer. I froze and turned off the headlamp. My eyes adjusted to the firelight, and I could hear the sound of someone or something walking slowly around the far side of my camp, just beyond where the light reached. It wasn't heavy enough for a bear. It sounded like a person walking carefully, deliberately. I stayed completely still, not even breathing. Then, nothing. Total silence. I waited for several minutes before moving again. I threw some dry leaves into the fire to make it flare and scanned the edge of the woods with my flashlight. I caught a glimpse of something between two trees, a flash of pale color, maybe clothing, but it was gone as fast as I saw it. My stomach sank. I called out once, just in case it was someone lost or a ranger, but got no reply. I decided not to sleep that night. I kept the fire going and sat with my back to a tree, my small hatchet in my hand. The hours dragged by. I never heard the footsteps again, but I felt watched the entire time. When the sun finally came up, I started packing immediately. As I was breaking down my tent, I noticed something I hadn't before. Just behind the tree line, about 50 feet from my camp, there was a piece of torn fabric caught on a low branch. I walked over and saw that it was a strip of camo cloth. Old, frayed, and stiff from being out in the weather. Beneath it, partially buried under leaves, I found a few more pieces. Part of a backpack strap, a cracked plastic container, and something that looked like an old license plate. It was from Tennessee and rusted through in places. No reason for that to be here unless someone had brought it in. I didn't stick around to investigate more. I strapped everything down and hiked out fast. I checked over my shoulder more times than I could count. I didn't stop for breaks, just pushed all the way to the car, heart pounding the whole time. When I got back to the lot, I noticed the blue truck was still there. Same spot. It hadn't moved in at least 3 days. There was a light film of dirt on the windows, and the inspection tag was from 2 years ago. I walked past it carefully and saw that the bed was full of gear, shovels, ropes, buckets, some empty jugs. It looked like it hadn't been touched in a while. I got in my car and drove straight out of there. Back at home, I tried looking up any reports of missing hikers or old camps in that forest. I didn't find much, just a couple of vague mentions on forums of people feeling uneasy or seeing strange shelters. No real news stories, nothing official. I sent the photos of the abandoned tent and the license plate to a friend who worked with search and rescue. He said it looked like a site. The last rays of the sun were disappearing behind the thick wall of pine trees as I arrived at the small clearing I'd picked for the night. I had been hiking for most of the day, carrying a full pack on my back, and my legs were tired but steady. This spot looked promising. A little flat space surrounded by tall trees, dry ground underfoot, and close enough to a small stream that I could refill my water bottles in the morning. The forest was quiet except for the steady sound of the stream and the occasional rustle of leaves as a breeze moved through the branches. I dropped my pack with a soft thud and took a deep breath. The air smelled clean and fresh, with a faint hint of pine sap and earth. I had come out here alone to clear my mind, to get away from the noise of the city and the buzz of everyday life. Just me, the forest, and a few days of solitude. No phone signal, no internet, no distractions. Just the wilderness and my own thoughts. I started setting up my small tent, pulling out the poles and laying the nylon flat on the ground. The fabric was stiff and new, but I'd done this many times before, so it didn't take long. As the sun dipped lower, the shadows stretched across the clearing, and I hurried a bit to finish before it got dark. I secured the tent stakes into the ground and pulled the rainfly tight over the top, even though the forecast showed no rain. I like to be cautious. Once the tent was ready, I gathered some dry wood for a fire. There was a pile of small sticks near some fallen branches just at the edge of the clearing. The ground was dry, but I was careful to clear the spot of any leaves and grass to avoid a forest fire. I built a small circle of stones around the spot and carefully stacked the twigs in the center. The fire caught quickly, and soon warm orange flames flickered, sending sparks floating up into the darkening sky. The warmth was comforting as the temperature began to drop. I pulled out my camping stove and boiled water for dinner, a simple freeze-dried meal that tasted better than it had any right to. I ate slowly, watching the fire crackle and listening to the night sounds of the forest. After dinner, I cleaned up and packed away my gear, then crawled into my tent with my sleeping bag. The forest outside was alive with the calls of owls and the rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush. The sky was clear, the stars bright. It was peaceful in a way that city life never was. But as I lay there, I noticed something. A soft sound outside, not natural, something like footsteps. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the steps were heavy and steady, not light or skittering like small creatures. They circled the clearing, slow and deliberate. I sat up quietly, holding my breath. The fire had burned low but was still glowing. I grabbed my flashlight and shone the beam out the tent door. Nothing. The shadows between the trees moved, but no sign of any person or animal. I watched for a long time, but the sound stopped. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks. I lay back down but didn't sleep well. Every little noise made me tense, heart pounding. The forest was no longer just peaceful. It felt watchful, like something unseen was lurking just beyond the glow of my fire. Morning came with a chill. The sun's rays filtered softly through the pine needles. I packed up my camp quickly, eager to get moving. The night had left me on edge. I didn't want to stay here any longer. As I walked along the trail toward the stream to refill my water, I noticed something. A footprint. Not an animal print, but a large boot print, pressed clearly into the soft mud near the water's edge. I knelt and examined it carefully. The size was at least a men's 11 or 12, and the tread was deep and rugged, the kind worn by hunters or hikers. What disturbed me was how fresh it looked, like it had been made within the last 12 hours. I looked around the clearing and saw more prints. They circled the tent site, coming close but never stepping on the actual ground where I had pitched my tent. Whoever had been here had stayed just out of sight. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled. I packed faster, heart racing. My mind raced with questions. Why hadn't I seen anyone last night? Who else was in these woods? Was this a hunting area? Did I accidentally camp on private land or somewhere dangerous? I pulled out my map and compass, checking for any signs of nearby cabins or roads. None showed up nearby. I decided to stick to the trail and hike back the way I came. I felt exposed, vulnerable, and increasingly uneasy. I double-checked my gear, made sure my phone was off in airplane mode to save battery in case of emergency, and started walking. The forest seemed different now. The birds were quieter, the shadows longer. Every sound was amplified. The crunch of leaves under my boots, the snap of a twig in the distance, the flapping of a bird taking flight. I tried to keep calm, but my pace quickened without meaning to. I reached a fork in the trail. One path led uphill toward a ridge, the other down toward the river. The map suggested the ridge path was longer but might lead to a trailhead with a road. The river path was shorter but less direct. I chose the ridge path, hoping for a quicker exit. As I climbed, I noticed more signs of recent human presence. Broken branches at waist height, flattened grass patches, and discarded items like an empty soda can and a crumpled snack wrapper. It felt like someone had been camping or hiking here recently, very recently. The sun was climbing higher now, and the heat was increasing. Sweat trickled down my back despite the cool forest air. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves. I kept telling myself that the woods were full of people, most harmless. Maybe the prints belonged to hunters or other hikers. But then I noticed something else. High above on a tree branch, a piece of cloth hung loosely. A red bandana, faded and dirty. It wasn't mine, and I didn't recognize it. Why was it there? Did someone leave it as a sign? It looked like it had been there a while, but not too long. I kept moving but remained alert. Every few steps, I glanced behind, half expecting to see someone watching me from the trees. I forced myself not to imagine things, but the feeling of being followed was strong. After about an hour of steady hiking, I reached the ridge's crest. From here, I could see the valley below, the river snaking through the trees like a silver ribbon. The distant sound of traffic was faint but audible. Relief flooded me. I was close to civilization. I pulled out my phone to check for signal. Nothing. The forest was still too thick, the ridge blocking reception. I took a moment to catch my breath, sipping water from my bottle. Then I heard it, a sharp crack, like a branch breaking close by. My heart jumped. I froze and scanned the trees, but saw nothing. The sound came again, closer this time, a heavy footstep breaking a branch. I dropped my pack and stood still, listening hard. Then I saw movement, a figure just on the edge of the clearing between the trees, too far to make out details but tall and solid. My mind raced. I wasn't expecting anyone here. Who was this? A hunter? A lost hiker? Or something else? The figure stayed just beyond the tree line, motionless. I didn't want to call out or draw attention. My instincts screamed to get away. I grabbed my pack, slung it on, and started moving down the ridge carefully, taking a different path that wound down through thicker brush, trying to avoid open spaces. The figure followed, keeping distance but moving steadily. I kept looking back, heart pounding, but the figure never approached directly, just watching, trailing. Panic rose, but I forced myself to stay calm and deliberate. I wasn't gonna run blindly through the woods. That could be dangerous. I aimed for a small clearing I'd seen on the map marked as an old logging road, hoping I could find a vehicle or at least a road to flag down help. The trail led me into a denser part of the forest. The trees were closer, the shadows deeper. The figure was still behind me, always visible when I glanced back. After about 20 minutes, I reached the clearing. It was larger than I expected, with old tire tracks and broken branches littering the ground. It looked like it hadn't been used in years, but it was an open space with no cover. I paused, heart racing, and tried my phone again. This time, a weak signal appeared, 1 bar. I quickly sent a text message to a friend with my location coordinates and a note that I needed help. Then I heard it again, the crunch of footsteps, but this time coming from the front of the clearing. I turned slowly to face the direction. The figure was there, stepping into the light filtering through the trees. Clad in dark clothing, a baseball cap pulled low, face obscured by shadow. I felt my stomach tighten. This was no casual hiker. The way he moved was deliberate, slow, watching. I backed away toward the edge of the clearing, scanning for any escape route. My eyes caught sight of an old pickup truck parked half-hidden behind a fallen tree. Its windows were dusty but intact. Without thinking, I ran toward the truck, fumbling with the door handle. It was locked. Panic hit full force. I looked around frantically. The summer I decided to go camping alone was supposed to be a break from everything. The city noise, the endless emails, the constant pressure to keep moving forward. I was tired. Tired of schedules, tired of people, tired of always pretending to be okay when inside I felt drained. I packed my backpack carefully with all the basics. A tent, a sleeping bag, a stove, food for 3 days, water filter, first aid kit, flashlight with extra batteries, map, compass, and a few personal items. The spot I chose was remote but not impossible to reach. A national forest area a few hours away from the nearest town, known for its quiet lakes and thick woods. I left early on a Saturday morning, driving out of the city as the sun rose. The roads got smaller and narrower, flanked by tall trees that thickened as I approached the forest boundary. The air changed too, getting cooler, cleaner. The kind of fresh air that fills your lungs so deeply it feels like you're breathing for the first time in months. My plan was simple. Hike in about 3 miles, find a decent clearing near the lake, set up camp, and spend a couple of nights alone with just nature and my thoughts. The hike started well enough. The trail was narrow but visible, with the sun filtering through the leaves in a golden patchwork on the ground. Birds chirped in the trees, a gentle breeze rustled the leaves, and the smell of pine and damp earth filled the air. I felt light and free as I walked, my pack steady on my back. The forest here was dense and alive, but not threatening, at least not yet. About 2 hours in, I reached a fork in the trail where a wooden sign pointed toward the lake, half covered in moss and faded paint. I chose the left path, which looked less traveled but seemed to head in the right direction. The air grew thicker, the trees closer together. The forest floor was uneven, with roots and rocks hidden under fallen leaves. I moved carefully, stepping over obstacles, glancing around but feeling no real worry. Just the occasional snap of a twig or the rustle of an animal in the brush kept me aware of my surroundings. Eventually, I reached the edge of the lake just before noon. It was smaller than I had expected but beautiful, still water reflecting the sky, bordered by reeds and wildflowers. The light here was softer, the quiet deeper. I found a clearing just a few yards from the shore, flat enough to pitch my tent. The ground was covered in dry pine needles, and the smell of damp moss lingered nearby. It was perfect. I set up my tent quickly, making sure the rain fly was secure even though the weather was clear. I arranged my sleeping bag and laid out my gear. After eating a quick lunch of trail mix and jerky, I took off my boots and sat on a fallen log by the water's edge. The calmness was almost hypnotic, broken only by the occasional call of a loon or the splash of a fish breaking the surface. For a few hours, I just sat and breathed it all in, feeling the tension leave my body. As the afternoon waned, I started gathering firewood. I knew I needed to build a good fire before dark, not just for warmth but for safety and comfort. I walked deeper into the woods around my site, collecting dry branches and twigs. The woods here were dense, with tall pines and thick underbrush. I noticed small animal tracks in the dirt and fresh signs of deer browsing nearby. It was peaceful but reminded me that I was in the home of many wild creatures. By the time I returned to my site with a small pile of wood, the sun was starting to sink behind the trees. I arranged the firewood carefully in a circle surrounded by rocks I found nearby. Striking a match, I coaxed a flame to life, blowing gently to feed the fire. The flames flickered and grew, casting long shadows on the trees around me. I sat back on a log, warmed by the firelight, eating a can of beans heated over the flames. The smell of smoke mixed with pine and earth made the moment feel timeless. The sky darkened slowly. Stars appeared one by one, bright and clear in the deep black above. I lay back on a blanket near the fire, looking up at the vastness of the night. It was quiet, peaceful, except for a few distant animal calls that echoed through the forest. I felt safe here, away from everything. But as the night grew deeper, I noticed subtle changes. The woods around me seemed to come alive in different ways. The shadows grew longer, darker, and the sounds shifted. The birds were silent now. Instead, there were rustles and snaps all around, branches breaking underfoot, leaves scraping softly, a steady background of movements I couldn't see. I stayed close to the fire, keeping my flashlight nearby. The warmth and light felt like a shield. I reminded myself that animals were just moving around, probably deer or raccoons searching for food. I even heard a distant howl, but that was normal in these woods, I told myself. But then something strange happened. The noises started to feel different, less like animals and more deliberate, like something was pacing or circling just beyond the firelight. The breaks in the brush sounded heavier, the footsteps uneven but steady. A part of me wanted to get up and look, to shine the flashlight toward the noise, but another part froze, frozen by the uncertainty of what I might find. I grabbed my pocket knife and held it tightly. I reminded myself this was a national forest, not some dangerous jungle. Still, the feeling was growing, like I was being watched, studied. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I found myself scanning the darkness just beyond the circle of light. Minutes passed, maybe more. The noises came closer, then receded, almost like someone was testing my nerve. I could hear heavy breathing mixed with the sound of something dragging along the forest floor. I swallowed hard and gripped my knife tighter. I remembered that at the parking lot earlier, the ranger had warned about recent sightings of people trespassing in the forest without permits, people who were not always friendly. I had brushed off the warning at the time, but now I wondered, could it be some other campers or hunters? Or worse, someone following me? I stayed as quiet as possible, not daring to move or make a sound. The fire crackled, throwing sparks into the night. My flashlight beam lay across my legs, ready. Every snap of a twig made me jump. Every breath felt louder than normal. The night seemed to stretch endlessly. Suddenly, I heard a low groan or grunt from the trees. Not animal, not normal. It was human. My heart slammed in my chest. I thought about the map and the fact I was miles from the nearest trailhead. No one should be here, but someone was, and clearly close. I felt my stomach twist in fear and anger. If this was someone dangerous, I needed to be ready. I fumbled to reach my phone, but there was no signal, just dead silence except for the noises in the woods. I pulled my knife out of the sheath. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. Then, from behind a thick pine about 15 feet away, I caught a faint shadow moving. I froze, watching. The figure didn't step into the firelight, but the shape was unmistakably human. Large, bulky, maybe wearing a jacket or something bulky enough to hide movement. I could see the outline of a face for a second, pale and hard in the dark. I remembered stories I had heard about people hiding in the woods, some hunting, some with darker motives. I also knew that making noise or confrontation could be dangerous, but staying still also felt like I was waiting to be caught. I decided to quietly gather my things, one by one, moving as slowly as possible, keeping the fire alive but not brightening it. I packed my food and stove first, then rolled up my sleeping bag. The shadow stayed just at the edge of the light, watching, silent. I tried to keep calm. Slowly, inch by inch, I moved toward the path I had come from. The shadow never moved closer but stayed close enough to see. I reached the edge of the clearing and paused, heart pounding, flashlight ready. The person never spoke or made a noise again, just stayed in place. I waited for what felt like an eternity before stepping onto the trail and starting to walk briskly back the way I came. The woods seemed to hold their breath. The usual nighttime sounds replaced by a heavy silence. Every few steps, I glanced behind me but saw nothing. The shadow was gone. The hike back was tense and long. I kept my flashlight sweeping side to side, watching for any sign of movement. I told myself to stay calm, to keep moving. Eventually, after what felt like hours, I emerged from the thick forest onto the gravel parking lot where my car was parked. The relief was overwhelming. The lights of the car, the open space, the absence of trees made me feel safe for the first time all night. I locked the doors and sat inside, breathing hard. I looked out at the dark woods, still feeling the weight of whatever was lurking there. I stayed in the car until dawn, waiting for the sky to lighten before driving away. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, where I filled up with gas and bought coffee, trying to shake the cold fear that had settled deep in my bones. Looking back now, I realized that what I encountered was probably some other person living rough or hiding in the woods, maybe someone who didn't want to be found. There were no supernatural things, no monsters, just real danger. It was early October, and the air had just started to shift into that clean, sharp kind of cold that meant summer was truly over. The trees were halfway through changing, which meant whole stretches of the forest looked like they were burning. Reds, oranges, even that bright yellow that seemed to glow when the light hit it just right. I'd taken a few days off work because I felt like I was going nuts in the city. I needed something quiet. I wanted to get away from noise, from screens, from crowds. So I picked a spot up in the Allegheny National Forest, a few hours' drive from where I lived in Pittsburgh. I didn't want a campground. I wanted to really camp, hike in, set up far from anyone, and just be still for a while. I planned on staying 3 nights. I packed for it the way I always do. I had everything: a solid one-person tent, 0-degree sleeping bag, bare canister for food, water filter, emergency beacon, knife, headlamp, backup headlamp, and plenty of food. Mostly dehydrated meals and some granola bars. I had layers for every possible change in temperature. My boots were already broken in. I had even checked the weather 10 times before I left. Cold, dry, clear skies. No storms, no fire warnings. Perfect. I parked my car at a trailhead where I'd gone before, but this time I was taking a different branch, a longer one that ran along a stream and eventually climbed into more rugged hills where fewer people went. I hiked in about 6 or 7 miles before I found a spot that felt right. Flat, dry, and tucked behind a small ridge that blocked the wind. The stream was about 50 yards off, just far enough to keep the sound faint and peaceful. I couldn't see the trail from where I pitched my tent, and I liked that. It meant no one could see me either. The first night was uneventful. The woods had that quiet that you only get in deep, remote places.
No engines.
No footsteps, just the occasional crack of a branch or shuffle of leaves from animals I never saw. I slept better than I had in weeks. Woke up with frost on the inside of the tent but felt great. Made coffee, filtered water, walked down to the stream and just sat on a rock for a while, watching the current roll over the stones. It was everything I needed. I spent the day hiking around the area, not following any trail, just exploring. I used my compass and left small markers when I thought I might need them to find my way back. I was always careful about that. I didn't take dumb risks. The forest floor was mostly clear this time of year, with patches of thick brush here and there. Some deer crossed my path around mid-afternoon and stared at me for a second before taking off. I didn't see another human all day. That was the goal, and I felt good about it. But that night, things started to feel different. Not dramatic, not scary at first, just different. Around sunset, While I was sitting near my tent eating one of those foil pack meals, I got this feeling I wasn't alone. I'd felt that before, sometimes while camping. Usually it was just my brain reacting to the quiet, playing tricks. But this time it came with something else. Silence. The usual low chirping of crickets was gone. No wind, no rustling, just an absolute dead silence, like the woods were holding their breath. I froze and listened. My ears strained so hard I thought they might pop. But I didn't hear anything. No footsteps, no animals, just stillness. I finished eating, packed the trash into my bear canister, and walked it a good distance from the tent. By the time I got back, it was almost fully dark. I got into the tent, zipped up, turned off my headlamp, and tried to sleep. That night, I kept waking up. I didn't know why. I'd fall asleep for maybe an hour at a time, and then I'd shoot awake again, heart beating fast for no reason. It wasn't noise. It wasn't cold. I just couldn't stay asleep. Once, around 3 a.m., I thought I heard a distant crunch in the woods. Just one. Not a series. Not rhythmic like footsteps. Just a single step on dead leaves. Then nothing. I lay still for a long time after that, gripping the knife I kept tucked next to my sleeping bag, listening so hard my temples hurt. Eventually, I must have drifted off again because I woke up to morning light. That day, I didn't feel like hiking much. I stayed near the camp and kept myself busy with small things. I boiled water, cleaned my filter, sharpened my knife just to pass the time. I walked a bit around the ridge to get a better look at the layout of the land. There was a fallen log on the slope above me that I hadn't noticed before, and I sat there for a while, scanning the tree line below. That uneasy feeling from the night before hadn't gone away. If anything, it had gotten stronger. In the early afternoon, I found something that didn't make sense. I was walking a slow loop around the camp, keeping track of where I stepped, when I spotted a patch of ground that looked slightly disturbed. Not fresh footprints exactly, but the leaves had been moved, like someone or something had walked through and tried to smooth it over. It wasn't part of my trail from the day before. It curved from the slope down toward the camp, almost like a semicircle. I crouched and looked closer. Some leaves had been crunched down more than others, and under them, I saw soft soil pressed in a way that wasn't natural. Could have been an animal. I told myself that right away. Maybe a bear, maybe a deer, but the spacing was wrong. It was more narrow, more like the width of a person walking. I didn't panic. I didn't leave. I just became more careful. I stayed closer to camp and kept my knife on my hip. I scanned the woods more often and kept glancing at the ridge. I felt like I was being watched, and no matter how much I told myself that was just anxiety, it didn't go away. That night, I didn't sleep. I tried. I laid down, wrapped in the sleeping bag, headlamp within reach, knife in hand. But my ears wouldn't stop straining, and my eyes wouldn't stay closed. Around midnight, I heard the noise again. A single, deliberate crunch of leaves. Closer than the night before, maybe 20 or 30 yards off. Then silence. Then another. It wasn't random. It wasn't an animal rooting around. It was the sound of someone trying to be quiet and failing. The intervals were too far apart for an animal. I stared at the tent ceiling, breath held, and didn't move. After the third crunch, I didn't hear anything else. I stayed like that until daylight. The next morning, something in me shifted. I wasn't calm anymore. I wasn't relaxed. I knew something was wrong. I got out of the tent, checked the area, and sure enough, more disturbed patches of ground. A curved line again, coming closer. Whoever it was, they were circling me. I looked up at the ridge, and for a split second, I thought I saw something move. Just a flicker of color behind a tree. Not enough to be sure, but enough to send ice down my spine. I packed up that morning. I didn't eat. I didn't make coffee. I stuffed everything into my pack as fast as I could without leaving anything behind. But I didn't take the same trail out. I didn't want to backtrack through where I thought they might be. Instead, I used my map and compass and cut east toward another trail that would loop me back to a different parking lot about 5 miles from where I started. It would be longer but safer, I thought, if I stayed calm. I didn't stay calm. About an hour into that hike, I started hearing the noises again. Light, slow movement behind me. I'd stop. Silence. I'd walk again. More crunches, soft ones, but steady. I turned around at one point and scanned the woods with my headlamp, even though it was broad daylight under the trees. Nothing. At some point, I realized I wasn't just hearing it. I was being followed. Not a bear, not a deer. Someone was behind me, matching my pace, stopping when I stopped, moving when I moved. I started jogging, not a sprint, just a fast walk with short bursts. I didn't want to waste all my energy, but I needed to put distance between me and whoever was back there. I was off trail, moving through undergrowth, jumping over fallen trees, scraping my arms and legs on branches. My pack kept catching on things. I kept looking over my shoulder, but I never saw anyone. Then I heard something that made my blood freeze. It was the sound of someone breaking into a run behind me. I didn't look. I just ran. I dropped my water bottle. I ran harder. I didn't care about stealth anymore. My breathing was loud, messy. Branches whipped my face. I slipped once and slammed my shoulder into a rock but didn't stop. I just kept moving until I saw the trail. Bright orange marker tied to a branch, like salvation. I got back on trail and followed it for miles. Didn't stop until I reached the parking area. It was empty. My car wasn't there. It was at the original lot. But there was a forest road that connected them. I sat down for a second to catch my breath and realized I was shaking. Every part of me was buzzing with adrenaline. Eventually, a pickup truck came down the road, some kind of Forest Service vehicle. I flagged it down and hitched a ride back to my car. I didn't explain much. I just said I had gotten turned around, which was partly true. When I got to my car, I threw my pack in the trunk and drove. It was late January in New Hampshire, deep in the heart of winter, and the mountain air was biting cold. We had planned this hike for weeks. The goal was to climb one of the 4,000 footers, a peak in the White Mountains that I had done before but could never get enough of. The snow had fallen heavily the night before, adding fresh layers to the already deep blanket that coated the ground. The trails would be icy, treacherous, and steep, but I was ready for it. I had all the right gear: insulated waterproof boots, gaiters, microspikes, a reliable ice axe, layered clothing, gloves, and a good pack filled with extra food, water, and emergency supplies. My hiking buddy was no novice either. We had been on countless winter hikes together, and we trusted each other's skills and judgment implicitly. We started early in the morning before sunrise. The sky was still a deep navy blue, with a few stars fading away as the horizon lightened. The air smelled crisp and clean, carrying the faint scent of pine and frozen earth. The trailhead was quiet, with only a few sets of fresh footprints in the snow from hikers who had started earlier. Our breaths came out in white clouds as we began the ascent. The ground was covered in a thick layer of snow, with patches of ice hiding beneath. We moved cautiously but steadily, our microspikes crunching softly against the frozen trail. The first miles were gentle, winding through dense stands of spruce and fir. The trees were heavy with snow, their branches bending under the weight. Every now and then, a flock of chickadees or juncos darted through the branches, their bright calls adding a bit of life to the silent woods. The snow was deep, but the trail was well marked with small orange blazes on the trees. The cold air bit at any skin exposed, but our layered clothing kept us warm and dry. I felt steady and strong, my legs working smoothly, my breathing calm and even. As we gained elevation, the forest began to thin. The tall, dense trees gave way to shorter, more stunted growth. The winds were stronger here, whipping through the branches and biting colder against our faces. The trail grew steeper, and the snow and ice thickened. The rocky terrain beneath the snow was more exposed, making the footing tricky. We switched to our ice axes and tightened our microspikes for extra grip. This part of the trail was always the most challenging in winter. The mountain's rocky face stretched ahead of us, covered by a thick sheet of ice. In the summer, this would have been a scramble over boulders, but now the ice smoothed everything into a slippery, deadly surface. The trail crossed this ice sheet diagonally, from right to left. Just before the ice began, there was a small ledge we had to jump down to reach it. I checked the landing carefully. The snow was packed hard, but I saw no obvious hazards. My buddy went first, moving carefully, placing his feet firmly on the ice as he crossed. I followed, lowering myself to the ledge and jumping down. My microspikes hit the ice first, but then something went wrong. My feet slipped out from under me in an instant. I wasn't sure what had caused it. Maybe it was a hidden patch of polished ice under the spikes or a small misstep. But the next thing I knew, I was sliding downhill on my butt. The momentum was fast and uncontrollable. The ice sheet sloped sharply downwards, and I was sliding feet first toward a sheer drop. The drop was about 15 feet, a vertical cliff carved into the mountain. Falling from that height wouldn't have been deadly, but it could have seriously injured me. Broken legs, crushed ankles, maybe worse. As I slid closer to the edge, panic flickered in my chest. The wind whipped past my face, cold and fierce. My hands scrambled for anything to grab. There, two small, stunted trees stood close together at the edge of the drop. Without thinking, I reached out and grabbed each tree with both hands. The bark was rough and cold, biting into my palms, but the grip held. The slide stopped abruptly, and I dangled there for a moment, heart pounding, legs trembling. I looked back up the slope where my buddy was standing, watching with wide eyes. I yelled up to him that I was okay, but I needed a minute to catch my breath. I sat there on the icy ledge, catching my breath, feeling my pulse slow. My legs tingled from the cold and adrenaline. The danger was far from over, but I needed to steady myself before trying to move. I tested my microspikes, tapping them against the ice to get a sense of their grip. The trees I was holding onto looked small but strong, their roots clutching the rocky soil beneath. After a few minutes, I started to carefully shift my weight, finding a way to edge back uphill and away from the drop. Once I was safe, my buddy came down to help me, his face serious but calm. Together, we moved slowly across the ice, stepping cautiously, using our axes for support. The rest of the hike to the summit was tense but uneventful. We reached the top just before noon, the wind howling around us as we took in the wide, snow-covered expanse below. The sky was a pale gray, heavy with clouds, but the view was breathtaking, endless white peaks stretching as far as the eye could see. We stayed for a short while, eating some food and drinking warm water from our thermoses before starting the descent. The trail back down was just as slippery and steep, but the sun was breaking through the clouds, warming the air slightly. We moved carefully, resting whenever we needed, keeping close and alert. The rest of the hike went smoothly. We reached the trailhead in mid-afternoon, tired but exhilarated. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the snow. I thought back to that moment on the ice, the sudden slide, the panic, the relief of grabbing those trees. It was the scariest moment I'd ever had on the mountain. Not because I had done anything stupid, but because sometimes, despite all the experience and preparation, nature can still surprise you. That day taught me a lot about respect. Respect for the mountain, respect for the ice, and respect for the small things, the stunted trees, the rocky ledge, the way your body can react in a split second. It was a reminder that even with all the gear, the training, and the experience, you can never be too careful. The mountain is always in charge. We packed up and left as the last light faded, the cold settling in again. The car heater felt like a blessing after hours in the cold, and the drive home was quiet, both of us lost in our thoughts. I knew I would be back to that mountain, to those winter trails, because there is something about the challenge, the beauty, and yes, even the danger that keeps pulling me back. But after that day, I never took an icy slope for granted again. This past summer, we visited Montana for the first time. It was a trip we had been planning for a while, drawn by the promise of vast wilderness, towering mountains, and endless hiking trails. When we finally landed at the small airport just outside a quiet town, the sun was shining brightly, the sky a deep, clear blue. The heat was strong but comfortable for July, the kind of day that makes you want to get out and explore immediately. So, without wasting any time, We grabbed our backpacks from the baggage claim, stepped outside, and immediately said to each other, "Let's go hiking right now." It felt like the perfect way to start our Montana adventure. We picked a popular trail near the airport, one known for its scenic views and manageable length. A nice 2 or 3 mile hike winding through dense forest and gentle hills. The trailhead was easy to find, and the path was well marked with wooden signs. As we set off, the air was fresh, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. The trees around us were tall and thick, their branches swaying slightly in the warm breeze. Birds chirped sporadically, and we caught glimpses of small animals darting through the underbrush. Everything felt peaceful, calm, and welcoming. We walked at a steady pace, taking in the sights and sounds, snapping a few pictures here and there. The trail was wide enough that we could walk side by side comfortably, and the ground was soft with layers of pine needles. We felt the sun on our faces, but the shade of the tall pines kept the temperature pleasant. About 2 miles in, the sky started to shift. The blue began to dull, replaced by patches of gray clouds drifting in from the west. The air grew cooler, and the birds quieted. It was subtle at first, but the weather was definitely changing. We talked to ourselves, silently agreeing that if the weather turned worse, we would turn back. We didn't want to get caught out in a storm far from the car. The last thing we wanted was to be stranded in the woods without shelter or dry clothes. So we kept an eye on the sky and moved a little faster. After about 20 more minutes, the clouds thickened, and a light drizzle began to fall, fine drops that made the needles on the trees glisten. The ground beneath us was starting to get slick, and the smell of wet pine filled the air. Then, suddenly, I heard it, a loud boom echoing through the forest. At first, I thought it was thunder, but the sky didn't seem dark enough for a real storm. Still, it was a strange sound, more powerful and close than anything I'd heard before while hiking. Then another boom followed quickly by another. They came in quick succession, loud and sharp. It wasn't like the distant, rolling thunder you hear during a summer storm. These were explosive sounds, like something heavy falling or breaking somewhere nearby. We froze for a moment, listening as the noise repeated, booming off the trees and hills. The wind suddenly shifted. At first, it was just a gentle breeze, but then it picked up with alarming speed. Pine needles, dust, and small bits of dirt whipped around our faces. It felt like a sudden gust, maybe close to 40 miles per hour, strong enough to push against us as we tried to stand upright. The air turned cold, and the sky darkened rapidly. We looked around, trying to figure out where the sounds were coming from. Then I saw it. Not thunder at all, but the tops of full-sized pine trees snapping and crashing down around us. The booms were the sounds of trees being torn from the earth, their trunks splitting and falling through the air like giant clubs. The noise was deafening, the forest alive with the violent sounds of destruction. Branches cracked and smashed against other trees, needles showered down in thick curtains, and dirt exploded from the ground where roots ripped free. I shouted to my girlfriend and sister, motioning urgently. We needed to run. There was no time to waste. We started sprinting back down the trail, the wind pushing against us and the sounds of falling trees all around. I glanced behind me and saw huge trees crashing down mere feet away from us, some falling across the path we were trying to follow. The ground shook with each massive impact. At one point, my sister ran just ahead of a tree as it crashed behind her, narrowly missing her by inches. Her face was pale, her breath coming in short gasps, but she kept moving without stopping. My girlfriend and I kept pace, the fear pushing us to run faster than we ever had before on a trail that had moments ago seemed so calm and inviting. The trail was suddenly filled with obstacles, fallen branches, uprooted trees blocking the path, and the ongoing roar of the wind tearing through the forest. The air smelled sharp and earthy, mixed with the scent of fresh pine sap broken open by the destruction. Our clothes were damp from sweat and rain, hair tangled with pine needles and dust. We finally reached the clearing where we had started, just as the storm seemed to lose some of its power. The trees beyond the trail were still creaking and groaning, but no more were falling. We stood there, catching our breath, hearts pounding, faces wet with a mix of rain, sweat, and dirt. The next day, the weather had cleared completely. The sun was shining again, and the sky was bright blue, almost like the day before. But the forest looked different. We went back to hike the full trail this time, determined to see just how much damage the storm had caused. As we walked, it became clear how severe it had been. At least 25 trees had fallen across the trail, blocking large sections completely. Some were massive pines, their roots ripped up and broken. Others snapped like toothpicks and scattered in pieces. The ground was uneven, littered with branches and needles, and the air still smelled faintly of wet wood and earth. We carefully climbed over or around each fallen tree, sometimes having to detour off the trail to find a clear path. The peacefulness of the forest was replaced by a quiet stillness, as if the storm had left a scar on the landscape. The animals seemed cautious too. We spotted fewer birds and animals than the day before. As we reached the end of the trail, I felt a deep respect for the power of nature. That storm had come out of nowhere, catching us completely off guard. It showed me how quickly things can change in the wilderness, how unpredictable and dangerous it can be even on a day that starts so calm and bright. Despite the fear and chaos of the storm, I felt grateful we had made it out safely. It was a reminder to always be prepared, to respect the environment, and to never underestimate the forces around us. That trip to Montana was unforgettable, not just for its beauty, but for the raw power we witnessed firsthand in those forested hills. We left the trail with a new appreciation for the wild, knowing that sometimes, even the most peaceful places can turn fierce in an instant. That day, the forest taught me a lesson I won't forget, one about survival, respect, and the unpredictable strength of nature. The air was biting cold, the kind of cold that sinks deep into your bones and makes your breath catch before it leaves your lungs. It was late winter, the sky a flat sheet of gray, threatening snow that never quite came. We were deep in Northumberland, miles from any sign of town or road, surrounded by nothing but the raw wilderness. This part of the country was famous for its bogs, endless patches of marshland and soft mud, some hidden under shallow water that could swallow a foot or more without warning. We'd spent the day pushing through this difficult terrain, and now, after nearly 15 miles on foot, exhaustion had settled like a weight on my shoulders. The last stretch should have been simple. The trail led to a small village where we had left the car, and all we had to do was follow the path back. My partner was eager to reach the end point quickly, tired and ready to rest, but I was stubborn. I suggested we try a different route, a shortcut I thought I remembered from an old map. I said it would cut off some time, avoid some of the worst bogs, and maybe give us a bit of adventure. She warned me against it, but I pressed on. That shortcut hadn't been used in decades. I found out the hard way. At first, the path looked promising, a narrow trail cutting through a thick line of trees. But it was clear no one had been here for years. The ground was uneven, covered with dead leaves that hid twisted roots and slippery patches of moss. The further we went, the worse it got. The trees grew closer, branches tangled in ways that forced us to duck and weave. The bogs, instead of disappearing, seemed to multiply on either side of us, sucking at our boots whenever we stepped too close. Time passed faster than we realized, and the sun was dipping low, a pale orange glow lost behind thick clouds. The forest swallowed the light quickly, and by the time we realized how far we had strayed from the main trail, dusk was giving way to full night. The deep winter darkness in Northumberland was something else entirely. No streetlights, no moon, no stars, just pure blackness that pressed down from all sides. We tried to turn back, but the route was nearly impossible to retrace. Every direction looked the same. The trees were black silhouettes against the black sky, and the bogs shimmered like invisible traps. Our footsteps grew cautious, careful not to slip into the mud or step into the water. The cold seemed to deepen now, colder than it had been all day, as if the forest itself had grown colder with the night. I felt panic start to rise in my chest. My partner's hand found mine in the dark, tight and steady, but I knew we were both scared. We had no torch. The batteries in our headlamps died hours ago, and I'd foolishly left spare ones in the car. No signal on our phones. No way to call for help. It was perfect darkness, the kind you don't see often unless you're far from civilization, and it was terrifying. The silence around us was complete except for the soft squelch of mud underfoot and the distant, muffled sound of something moving. I couldn't tell if it was the wind or some animal. Every few seconds, my heart jumped. Every shadow seemed to shift and grow. The cold was biting deeper now, fingers and toes numbing despite the layers we wore. We stumbled on, desperate for any sign of the trail, any break in the trees, anything. After what felt like hours, we found a faint path, the main route we'd meant to take, and relief flooded through me. But the relief was short-lived. Out of the blackness came a low, guttural growl. I froze. My partner squeezed my hand tighter. Ahead, shapes began to move just beyond the edge of the trail. Bulls. Large, angry bulls. They were known to roam the area in winter, some wild, some owned by local farmers but loose in the forest. These ones were big, with thick horns and angry eyes shining in the faint light. The bulls charged. We tried to back away, but the ground was slippery and uneven. One bull came so close I could feel its breath, hot and rank. The sound of hooves pounding the frozen earth made my blood run cold. I remembered once, long ago, when my first wife was chased by a rampaging ram in the Scottish Highlands. That had been frightening, but somehow even funny in retrospect. This was something else entirely, bigger, more dangerous. We ran, not just fast, but desperately, blindly, through the trees and over bogs. My boots sank deep into mud, almost pulling me down. The branches scraped my face and tore at my clothes. Behind us, the bulls bellowed and charged again, their heavy bodies crashing through underbrush. At one point, my partner slipped, almost falling into a deep bog. I grabbed her just in time and pulled her back up. My heart hammered so loud I thought it would burst. I could feel the sharp sting of cold mud on my hands where I grabbed at her jacket. Eventually, we burst out of the forest onto a narrow dirt road. The bulls stopped at the tree line, watching us with angry, steaming nostrils. We didn't wait to see if they would follow. We ran down the road until we reached the village, finally finding a street lamp and the faint glow of houses. We were soaked, covered in mud, shaking with cold and fear. I looked at my partner's face, pale but alive, and realized how close we had come to losing everything. That reckless decision to take the shortcut, my stubborn pride, had put us both in terrible danger. If it hadn't been for a stroke of luck and pure adrenaline, we might have ended up trapped in those bogs or gored by those bulls. That night, wrapped in a warm blanket by the fire back at the car, I knew something had changed. I had always thought I was careful, that I could handle the wild, but I was wrong. I had underestimated the land, the cold, the darkness, and the animals that lived there. That choice to deviate from the path almost cost us our lives. I will never make that mistake again. No more shortcuts through unknown forests in winter. No more risking the perfect darkness that hides danger in every shadow. From now on, I will follow the trail, no matter how boring or slow it seems, because some things aren't worth the risk. I still think back to that night sometimes, how the silence pressed on us like a living thing, how the bulls charged through the dark like nightmares come to life, and how close we came to disaster. It was my mistake, plain and simple, and I carry that with me every time I go into the wild. But it also taught me respect. Respect for the land, for the cold, for the dark, and for the simple wisdom of sticking to the known path. That respect saved us, in the end, even if I nearly lost us both first. Climbing that volcano in the dead of winter was one of the hardest things I've ever done. The cold was biting, the wind was relentless, and the ice under my crampons was slick enough to keep me on my toes every second. I had been pushing hard for hours, steadily axing my way up the slope, trying to keep my footing on the steep ice fields and frozen scree. The thin, icy air made each breath feel like fire in my lungs, but the thought of reaching the summit kept me going. By the time I neared the top, my fingers were numb, even inside my thick gloves, and my legs were shaking from the strain. The snow had been whipping around in swirling gusts all day, blowing ice crystals into my face so I barely saw a thing at times. But now, finally, I could see the summit ridge just ahead, a narrow knife edge of ice and rocks slicing into the sky. The ice on the ridge looked solid, but something caught my eye just in front of me. A patch of ice that didn't quite match the rest. It was smoother, less frosted, and just slightly different in color and texture. It was subtle, but enough to make me stop and take notice. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I knew better than to ignore something like that. I wasn't stupid. I'd been on enough climbs to know that what looks solid isn't always solid, especially on a volcano that was essentially a frozen, brittle giant. I lowered myself carefully, planting my axe tip on the suspicious patch, and gave it a gentle prod. The axe bit in deeper than I expected, and the surface cracked beneath it. Before I could react, the ice under my feet started to shift. Then suddenly, it broke away completely. The ground gave way in a terrifying instant. I watched in horror as a jagged hole, at least 10 feet wide, opened right beneath me. For a split second, I could see straight down into a dark abyss. The crater of the volcano yawned below, hundreds of meters deep. The edge of the ice collapsed into the void, smashing through what must have been a brittle floor of frozen snow and rock. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. At that moment, I realized my weight had shifted forward with the ice breaking, and I was barely holding on to the edge with nothing but the tips of my crampons. The ground around me was rearranging itself, tilting, making my footing even more precarious. I had to scramble backwards fast, flailing my arms like a wild person, desperate not to fall into that black hole. I made this strange, awkward backward wheelie move, using my ice axes like anchors, digging them into the solid ice just behind me, fighting gravity with every ounce of strength I had. It was one of the most terrifying moments of my life, just hanging there between falling into the crater and slipping backwards down the mountain. I kept telling myself to calm down, to breathe slowly, but it was nearly impossible. The wind howled like a beast around me, freezing my face and sending tiny shards of ice into my eyes. My heart was racing, my hands shaking on the axes, but I managed to dig them deeper and get my legs under me. Slowly, inch by inch, I lowered myself to one knee, still gripping the axes hard. I looked around and saw that I was standing on the edge of a massive cornice, a large, unstable overhang of snow and ice that had formed over the side of the volcano. I hadn't realized until that moment how far out I had been walking. The cornice was cracked and broken in places, like a giant frozen wave about to collapse. If I had taken just one more step forward, I would have gone straight through and fallen to who knows where. I took a deep breath, my breath visible in the freezing air, and forced myself to stay calm. The sun was dipping behind the mountain now, casting long shadows across the icy slope. The wind was picking up, threatening to blow me off balance again. I knew I couldn't stay there forever. I gathered all my strength and slowly shifted my weight back onto solid ground, retreating carefully from the edge of the cornice. Every step felt like a gamble. The ice cracked softly under my crampons, a constant reminder that this mountain was a dangerous beast, ready to swallow me whole if I wasn't careful. As I moved back, I scanned the ridge behind me, looking for a safer route down. I didn't want to rush, but I also knew staying in one place was no good. The cold was starting to get into my bones, and my fingers were stiffening despite my gloves. I worked my axes into the ice for stability and edged sideways along the ridge, careful to avoid any other suspicious patches. The descent was slow and exhausting. I had to trust my instincts, and every step was deliberate. The wind was relentless, whipping snow into my face, freezing the moisture on my eyelashes. My legs were trembling, and my breathing was shallow, but I didn't dare stop for long. I was on alert for any sign of unstable ice or rock. Eventually, I reached a flatter section where the snow was packed hard and steady. The sense of relief was overwhelming. I stopped for a moment, crouching down to take off my gloves and rub my numb fingers. My heart was still hammering, but I felt a little safer now. The sun was setting fast, and I knew I needed to get back to camp before dark. The way back was no picnic either. The trail was mostly covered in snow, and I had to navigate around ice patches that could easily send me sliding down the mountain if I wasn't careful. I kept my ice axes ready and my crampons digging in as best as I could. The wind howled all around me, cold and unforgiving. By the time I got back to the base camp, the sky was a deep purple, the stars beginning to twinkle overhead. My fingers were frozen and my clothes stiff with ice, but I was alive. I set up my small stove to warm up some water for tea, my hands shaking as I moved. The experience had rattled me, but I felt a strange surge of gratitude. Grateful that I had trusted my instincts, grateful that I had noticed that patch of ice before it was too late. That night, lying in my tent with a thick layer of frost coating the outside, I thought about how close I had come to falling into that crater. The thought made my stomach churn. The mountain was beautiful, yes, but it was also cold, silent, and indifferent to anyone who tried to conquer it. I slept fitfully, dreams haunted by the image of the gaping hole beneath me, the cracking ice, and the desperate backward scramble to safety. When morning came, the sun rose over the ridge, painting the frozen slopes with soft gold light. I packed up quickly, eager to get off that mountain while I still could. The climb had tested me like nothing else before. It had reminded me how small and vulnerable I was in the face of nature's power. But it also taught me to be cautious, to respect the mountain, and to always pay attention to the signs beneath my feet. I left that volcano behind. The memory of the near fall burned into my mind forever. From then on, every step I took on ice or snow was careful and deliberate, never rushing, always alert. That winter climb was a stark lesson in humility, a reminder that the mountain doesn't care who you are or what you want. It only cares if you survive. And that day, I was lucky enough to make it back alive. I've had my fair share of close calls in the Idaho wilderness. Moose charging out of nowhere, storms that turn the sky into a black curtain of rain and wind, mountain lions lurking in the shadows, and even some encounters with people that left me uneasy. But the single most intense rush I've had in recent years came from something way less dramatic than I expected. It was one of those moments where your mind twists the smallest detail into a full-blown nightmare. It wasn't a storm or a mountain lion attack, but it still squeezed my chest like nothing else. It's a story I don't really like telling, but here it is. I was camped near an alpine lake high up in Idaho's mountains, roughly at 9,000 feet elevation. It was late summer, but the nights were already cold. The kind of cold that creeps under your skin and makes your breath cloud in the dim light of your headlamp. I'd had a rough day on the trail, longer than planned, tougher terrain, and a few missteps that left me tired and stiff. I was filtering water from the lake well after dark. The air was crisp and still, and the sky was completely overcast with high clouds. There wasn't a moon to light up the night, and with no towns or camps nearby, the sky was pitch black except for the thin beam of my headlamp cutting through the darkness. There's a reason parts of Idaho are designated dark sky reserves. The absence of artificial light out here is almost overwhelming. You can see the stars, no, not see. The stars seem to press on you like tiny sparks in a deep black void. It's humbling, but at that moment, all I could feel was exhaustion, the heavy weight of my muscles, and the cold that made me want to just crawl back into my tent. I crouched by the water's edge, filtering water with my Sawyer squeeze filter, the faint sound of dripping water the only noise. The lake was calm, its surface like glass reflecting faint outlines of the cliffs towering above. These cliffs rose steeply, almost vertical, sheer rock faces peppered with patches of talus and sparse shrubs clinging to cracks and ledges. As I worked, my headlamp swept across the rocky wall beside me. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught a faint glimmer, something small and round reflecting the light. At first, I thought it might be a glint of a loose rock or maybe a trick of the light. But then it flickered again, a reflection, and I, up high, way above me on the cliffs, probably several hundred feet. I froze. The eye held still for a moment before moving slowly, then steadily descending. My heart started to pound, adrenaline creeping in to replace some of the tiredness. I wasn't hallucinating or imagining things. Something was coming down the cliff, and it was heading straight for me. The slope was brutal, too steep and rocky for anything other than a sure-footed climber. The usual suspects in these parts would be mountain goats or bighorn sheep, mountain lions, or bears. But bears don't usually climb sheer cliffs, and the color of the reflection ruled out black or white fur. It was a neutral tan or brownish color, which ruled out goats and sheep for the most part, especially since I never saw sheep in the area, and they tend to travel in groups anyway. It had to be a mountain lion. I've had several encounters with mountain lions before. They're magnificent but deadly animals. You respect their space, stay calm, and don't run. So far, that strategy has kept me safe. But this wasn't a usual encounter. The way this animal moved, focused, purposeful stalking, it reminded me of a story a friend told me about a lion attack that had nearly hospitalized him. It was the same cold, steady, unblinking approach. I didn't have any weapon on me. No trekking poles, no knife, just my headlamp, a small water filter, and my wits. My in-reach satellite communicator was back at camp, so no way to call for help. If this thing wanted me, I was alone, and I knew if a lion attacked, I wouldn't stand a chance. My breathing got heavier. Every sound was amplified. The soft scrape of rocks, the faint rustle of dry brush on the cliff, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I slowly picked up a rock from the ground. Not much of a weapon, but it was better than nothing. My whole body was tense, ready to fight or run, but neither felt like an option. Then the animal stepped out from behind a huge boulder just a few feet away. I shone my headlamp directly on it. I expected a mountain lion's sleek, powerful body, its intense eyes fixed on me, muscles coiled for the attack. What I saw instead made me freeze. It was a mule deer doe, stupid, scared doe. She was standing there, as startled by me as I was by her. She had been the source of the reflective eye in the distance, her wide eyes shining in my headlamp's beam. She stepped down carefully to the water's edge and began to drink. Took a moment for my racing heart to slow down. I lowered the rock and shifted back from the water, giving her some space. The night was quiet again, except for the soft splash of her tongue lapping the cold lake water. After a few long seconds, she bolted away into the dark, disappearing into the night. I sat back down by the lake, headlamp off, taking deep breaths. My muscles started to relax, the adrenaline slowly ebbing away. The fear I'd felt was very real, but it was a trick of exhaustion and darkness playing on my mind. I finished filtering my water, packed up slowly, and walked back to my tent, careful not to make a sound. When I got inside my tent, I laid on my sleeping pad, staring at the tent ceiling, thinking about what just happened. The wild is full of surprises. Sometimes your mind can turn a quiet night into a scene from a horror movie. Sometimes you think you're face to face with a deadly predator when it's just a scared deer trying to survive the night as much as you are. It was a wake-up call. Not just to stay alert, but to respect the wilderness and the creatures in it, no matter how small or harmless they seem. By dawn, the sky was clear again, and the mountains glowed with the soft light of early morning. I packed my gear and started down the trail with a new sense of calm. The night's tension stayed with me for a while, but it was a reminder that in the wild, sometimes the scariest moments are the ones your mind creates. I never forgot that night at the Alpine Lake. The way the dark made everything more intense, the way my tired mind almost turned a harmless doe into a deadly predator. It taught me something important about fear and reality, and how sometimes the biggest scares come from inside your own head. The rain had been coming down steadily for most of the day. Not hard enough to be dangerous, but enough to keep everything damp and heavy and cold. I was somewhere near the Idaho-Montana border, not too far off from where the Continental Divide Trail weaves through the mountains and into forested valleys that seem to stretch on forever. I was about a month into my through hike, and though I'd already seen some rough weather in Colorado, nothing had made me as uneasy as that day. It wasn't just the rain or even the wind, though both were miserable in their own ways. It was how the forest felt. Hollow, like the trees themselves were tired. I remember the sound the most. The wind wasn't a steady howl. It came in bursts, and each time it picked up, the tall pines creaked and groaned like old ships straining against ropes. I could feel the tension in my shoulders, like I was bracing for something. Each gust made me clench my jaw, my hands gripping my trekking poles a little tighter. My shoes were soaked. My pants were stuck to my legs. I could feel cold water sliding down my back underneath my rain jacket. My hat had long since lost the battle with the wind, and the hood of my jacket kept flapping, occasionally letting water trickle down the back of my neck. There wasn't much to do except keep moving. I wasn't near any real shelter, and I didn't want to set up camp early. The slope I was traversing cut along a narrow ridgeline, with steep drop-offs to the left and an incline to the right thick with standing dead trees. Trees I didn't think much about at first. I'd passed plenty of them in the past few weeks, but this part of the trail seemed to run through an old burn zone, or maybe a beetle kill area, because so many of the trunks were gray and lifeless. No leaves, no needles, just skeletal wood standing still like grave markers lining the trail. I should have taken it more seriously. I'd read about blowdowns and the danger of deadfall in high wind conditions, but I'd never actually seen a tree fall before. It's the sort of thing that feels rare, like lightning strikes or avalanches. You know it happens, but it never happens when you're watching. Not until that moment. The wind had picked up again, hard. I remember squinting into it, lowering my head, trying to make out the trail ahead through the blur of rain. The air was filled with noise, rushing, howling wind mixed with the clicking of my rain jacket and the squeaking of wet nylon straps on my pack. But underneath all that, I heard something different. A crack. It was loud, sharp, like a gunshot. I stopped walking without thinking, just froze. Then I heard it again, louder this time and followed by a deep groaning sound. Not like the creaking I'd heard earlier. This was something straining, something tearing. My eyes went up the trail, and that's when I saw it. A pine tree, maybe 40 feet ahead, was moving, not swaying like the others, tilting. The whole crown of it shifted in a way that didn't make sense at first. I blinked. For a second, I couldn't process it. It looked like the top of the tree was sliding off center. Felt wrong, like watching a building bend. Then it tilted harder, and I understood. The entire trunk was coming down, and it was coming straight at me. I should have moved immediately, but I stood there for half a second too long, just watching. I remember thinking how slow it seemed, like it was happening in slow motion. But it wasn't. My brain was just behind. The roots tore free with a loud pop, and the entire base of the tree twisted in the mud. Rain sprayed outward like a sheet of mist as the roots ripped from the soil. The trunk began to fall, and I realized it was going to land lengthwise, directly along the trail. If I stayed there, I'd be crushed. That's when something snapped in me. I remembered this scene from a movie, Prometheus, where the characters ran from a giant rolling thing by staying in its path instead of moving sideways. That moment of memory cut through the panic like a knife. I turned and sprinted to the right, off the trail, slipping in the wet leaves and needles, feet sliding on the slope. I ducked under a branch and threw myself toward the thicker part of the hill. I hit the ground just as the tree came down with a crash. The sound was unreal. It shook the air. I felt it more than I heard it. A deep, chest-rattling boom followed by a splintering crack. I turned and saw it, 60 feet of thick, gray wood stretched across the trail, a shattered end where the trunk had snapped as it hit the slope. The crown was a twisted mess of limbs and broken branches, some of them still swaying from the impact. I lay there in the wet dirt, heart pounding, breathing hard. My hands were shaking. I remember thinking I almost died. If I had hesitated another second, if I had gone forward instead of sideways, I would have been under that tree, crushed flat. No one would have found me for days, maybe weeks. After a minute, I stood up, wiped the mud off my hands, and slowly walked back toward the trail. I stared at the tree, tried to trace where it had fallen from. The wind was still blowing, and now every creak and groan made me flinch. The whole forest felt like it was holding its breath. I climbed over the fallen trunk, careful not to slip, and continued on, glancing up at every tree I passed for the next hour. That wasn't the only close call I had on that trip. A week or so later, I came within a step of putting my foot down on a rattlesnake. I was walking through a grassy stretch below Treeline, just south of Lemhi Pass, and the ground was warm, dry, and quiet. I'd been zoning out, thinking about my food resupply, when I heard that unmistakable rattle, dry, buzzing, and sharp. I froze again and looked down. The snake was stretched out across the trail, coiled loosely in the warmth of the dirt. I hadn't seen it at all. One more step and I would have landed right on its back. It didn't strike, but it didn't move either. It just stared at me with those cold, blank eyes and kept rattling. I backed away slowly, heart thumping in my ears, and detoured off the trail by a good 15 feet, keeping my eyes on the snake the whole time until it finally slid away into the brush. But the worst scare came later, somewhere in the Bitterroots. I was camped for the night near a small creek, maybe 15 miles north of Chief Joseph Pass. It was a quiet spot, too quiet actually. The air was still and the trees didn't move much. I'd set up my tent just before dusk, cooked my dinner about 100 feet away, and hung my food bag from a decent branch, though it was hard finding a good tree in that area. I went to bed early, exhausted. Sometime after midnight, I heard a sound, a slow, deliberate crunch of twigs just outside my tent. Then another. I held my breath. My body went rigid. I didn't move. I just lay there listening. There was no wind, no rain, just those footsteps, heavy, slow, padded. I could hear breathing low and steady, a sniffing sound, something brushing against the nylon wall of the tent. I didn't need to guess. I knew it was a bear. It circled the tent once, then again. I didn't have any food in there, just my sleeping bag, pad, and some clothes. But that didn't seem to matter. The bear wasn't in a hurry, kept sniffing, brushing the tent fabric with its side. I could see the silhouette of its bulk moving against the dim moonlight. It stopped by the vestibule, pressed its nose against the mesh, then moved on. I didn't move a muscle, not for 20 minutes, maybe longer. Eventually the sound faded, and the bear wandered off. But I didn't sleep much after that. I just lay there waiting for it to come back. It never did, but I kept a tight grip on my bear spray until sunrise. That section of the CDT northern Idaho into Montana was some of the most beautiful terrain I'd ever hiked. But it was also some of the most intense. The weather could change in a flash. The isolation was real. Cell service was non-existent. And the trail itself, while marked, often felt more like a suggestion than a path. I'd go hours without seeing another person. Days sometimes. The forest was deep and old and full of things that didn't care about you one way or another. That day with the tree stuck with me, more than the bear or the snake, because there was nothing aggressive about it, nothing intentional. It was just nature doing what it does. The wind pushed too hard. The tree was already dead. The ground was soaked, and gravity did the rest. It didn't target me. It didn't care that I was there. I was just in the wrong place at the wrong time, and somehow I lived through it. Pure chance. When I finally made it to the end of my through hike, months later, I thought about that tree more than anything else. People always asked what the scariest moment was, and I always pictured that crown starting to tilt. That snap of wood under pressure. The second where my brain finally understood. That's coming right at me. But I also thought about how I'd reacted. How something in me had kicked in, just fast enough. I'd spent so long preparing for the hike, gear lists, resupply boxes, trail reports. But no one tells you how to respond when death shows up without warning. No one tells you that your brain might freeze for a second, that you might not run right away, that even when it counts the most, you still have to remember to step sideways. I finished the CDT a little thinner, a little scruffier, and a lot more. It was a Friday in late October when me and 3 of my closest friends, Evan, Mark, and Jared, decided to go hiking deep into the woods for the weekend. We'd done day hikes plenty of times before, but this was the first time we planned to hike in and actually camp overnight far from any trailheads or park roads. The idea was simple. Disconnect from everything, get away from work and noise, sit around a fire, eat whatever we could cook ourselves, and sleep out in nature. We had a few supplies, tents, enough food, and water filters in case we needed to refill from a stream. None of us were exactly survival experts, but we weren't clueless either. We all grew up around the Appalachian foothills, spending time outside, hunting, fishing, just being in the woods, so this didn't feel like a big risk. The place we chose was about a 2-hour hike in from where we parked. It wasn't an official trail, more like a forgotten hunter's path we had read about online. We figured the remoteness would mean we'd have the entire area to ourselves. As we moved deeper into the woods, the trees started closing in tighter. The trail became harder to follow, covered with dead leaves, branches, and patches of brush that had been left untouched for years. Every now and then, we had to stop to check the map or let someone catch up, especially when we reached a steep ridge or a dry creek bed. It took us longer than expected to reach the clearing we had picked out on the map. It was just past a small slope on the northern side of a hill, tucked away behind a stretch of dense pines. The clearing itself was maybe 40 feet wide, relatively flat, and surrounded on all sides by trees that looked like they hadn't seen a chainsaw in decades. A soft layer of pine needles made the ground feel like a mattress. There were no signs that anyone else had camped there before. No fire ring, no trash, not even an old boot or bottle cap. It felt untouched, like we were the first ones in a long time to even walk through. We set up camp fast. 2 tents, one for me and Evan, one for Mark and Jared, positioned close together with enough room to move between them. About 6 feet away from the tents, we built our fire ring using rocks we pulled from the edge of the clearing. We cleared leaves, dug a shallow pit, and set up firewood that we gathered from nearby. The sky was starting to go dark when the fire finally caught. It was chilly, but not freezing, just cool enough that the fire felt good when you stood near it. As the flames grew and we all settled down around it, we ate, talked, and just let the sounds of the forest wrap around us. You could hear everything out there. Wind moving through branches, distant calls from owls, dry leaves skittering across the ground, maybe from squirrels or raccoons moving nearby. It wasn't completely silent, but it was quiet enough that anything out of place would stand out. That was part of what made the place feel so peaceful. At one point, just messing around, I took a long, thick stick I had found and started whittling the end of it with my knife. The others were laughing, saying I looked like a caveman, but I kept going. I shaved down one end to a pretty sharp point. It wasn't a perfect spear, but it looked kind of badass when it was done. I joked that it was for protection, in case something came too close during the night. Everyone laughed it off. Still, I jammed the point into the ground right beside my tent, sticking straight up just in case. Even though I wasn't serious, there was still a part of me that liked having it nearby. I've always believed that even a little preparation can make you feel a lot safer. After a few hours, the fire started to burn down. The logs were mostly embers, and we were tired from the hike, so we all climbed into our tents. I zipped up and got into my sleeping bag. It took a while for the forest noise to fade from my awareness, but eventually I drifted off. Couldn't have been more than an hour or so before I woke up again. The first thing I noticed was how still everything was. No wind, no rustling, just dead silence. I opened my eyes and lay there, staring at the dark fabric above me. The fire was dead by now, and the only light came from the moon filtering through the mesh at the top of the tent. I didn't know what had woken me until I heard it. Something outside, a low crack like a branch being stepped on. Then a second one, slower, heavier, like someone shifting their weight on dry wood. At first I thought maybe it was one of the guys going out to take a piss, but then I realized I hadn't heard any zippers. And whatever was out there wasn't moving like a person. It was too slow, too cautious, like it was testing the ground, trying not to be noticed. I could feel my heartbeat pick up as I listened. Another crunch, then a shuffle. It was close now, right outside the tent. I held my breath, lying perfectly still. Then something touched my foot. It was quick, but it was real. Just a light pressure through the fabric of the tent, like a hand brushing over it. Not hard enough to hurt, just enough to feel. I jerked back instinctively, pulling my feet closer to my body. For a second, I thought I might have imagined it. Maybe I had kicked the wall of the tent in my sleep. But before I could convince myself of that, I heard more movement, this time just outside the tents, like someone circling them. I whispered to the others to wake up, trying not to make any noise that would draw attention. After a few minutes, I heard the soft rustle of their tent opening. We all stepped out into the cold night together. The moon was high, casting long shadows across the clearing. Everything looked calm, but we were all alert, scanning the treeline, trying to find what had made the noise. That's when I looked over at the spot where I had left the stick, the one I had sharpened earlier. It was broken in half. The sharp end was still stuck in the ground, but the rest of it had been snapped clean. Not stepped on, not cracked from dryness, snapped. And the way it had broken didn't look accidental. The other half was lying about 4 feet away, like it had been tossed there. We didn't find anything else. No footprints, no signs of animals, no fur, no obvious trail leading away. The dirt was too packed to show impressions clearly. After searching the area with our flashlights for maybe half an hour, we decided to go back into the tents and wait for morning. We kept our boots on and knives nearby. I barely slept the rest of the night. Every sound outside felt louder than it should have been. Every gust of wind made me hold my breath. I didn't hear that slow movement again, and nothing touched the tent after that, but I kept expecting it. When daylight finally came, we got up fast and packed everything. The fire pit was just as we'd left it, our gear untouched, but that broken stick stayed in my mind the whole time. I picked up both halves and brought them with me. Part of me didn't want to leave them behind. Another part wanted to take a closer look at them later, like maybe I'd see something I missed. Claw marks, teeth, anything to explain what had happened. The hike back to the car felt different. The woods didn't feel the same in the morning light. It was like the trees were watching. Every snapping branch in the distance made me turn my head. We didn't talk much on the way back. I think all of us were trying to make sense of it in our own heads. And maybe we were each trying not to sound like we were scared. None of us said the word animal or tried to explain it with something logical. We just walked in silence until we reached the car. It's been almost a year since that trip. We never went back to that spot, and none of us have camped that deep in the woods again. I still have that broken stick, both pieces sitting in my garage. I've looked at them more than once, trying to make sense of it. There's no sign of teeth, no tool marks, nothing that suggests exactly what caused it. But it was broken on purpose. That much I believe. And I still remember the feeling of that pressure on my foot through the tent wall. That wasn't an animal stepping over me. It felt more deliberate than that. We survived that night. Nothing worse happened. But the part that stays with me isn't the fear, it's the not knowing. The fact that we were out there, miles from anyone, and something walked right into our camp, broke something we made, and then disappeared. It didn't try to hurt us. It didn't take our food or tear into our tents. It just came close enough to be noticed, close enough to remind us we weren't alone out there. That's what keeps me up sometimes. Not the danger, but the idea that someone or something was out there with us, watching, testing boundaries, letting us know we weren't as alone as we thought. And whatever it was, it knew exactly how close it could get. The sun was barely up when I laced my boots and stepped out of my small cabin on the edge of the forest. The air was crisp, a hint of chill still hanging from the night, and the sky was a soft gradient from pale orange near the horizon to deep blue above. I had planned this hiking trip for weeks. Just me, a pack full of essentials, and miles of untouched trails winding through the dense woods of the Appalachian foothills. It was supposed to be a weekend escape, a chance to clear my mind and soak up the calm of nature. The forest greeted me with a quiet stillness that was almost sacred. Pine needles cushioned my every step as I made my way along the narrow dirt path. The trees towered around me, ancient and steady, their bark rough under my fingertips when I paused to steady myself or check my footing. I noticed the subtle sounds. A bird calling somewhere above, the soft rustle of leaves as a breeze sifted through the branches, and the distant gurgle of a creek cutting through the valley below. Everything felt untouched, pure, as if the world outside didn't exist. The first few miles went smoothly. The trail was clear, marked by faded orange blazes on tree trunks every few hundred feet. I kept a steady pace, breathing in the scent of pine and earth, feeling my muscles warm and loosen up as I climbed steadily upward. At one point, the trail skirted a steep ridge with a narrow drop-off on my right. I paused to look down. The valley stretched out below, a quilt of greens fading into the morning mist. It was stunning, peaceful, and I could have stayed there for hours just watching the sunlight creep over the hills. But as the morning wore on, the trail grew less defined. The blazes became more sporadic, sometimes almost invisible behind moss and bark. The forest thickened too, branches brushing my shoulders and underbrush snagging at my pants. I wasn't worried yet. I knew the route well enough, and I had a map and compass tucked inside my jacket pocket just in case. I had done this hike before, though never alone for this long. I stopped to check the map and compass. The sun was high now, casting strong light through the canopy. I could see the general direction I needed to head, but the trees around me all looked the same, a wall of green stretching endlessly in every direction. I put the map away and pressed on, careful to note landmarks. An oddly shaped rock here, a fallen tree there, to help me keep track of my path. That's when the feeling settled in. Not fear exactly, but a creeping sense of unease that I couldn't shake. I glanced behind me, half expecting to see someone or something, but there was only the forest, calm and silent. My steps slowed, senses sharpening. The wind picked up slightly, carrying with it a faint, strange smell. Something sharp and metallic, like rust or old blood, faint but unmistakable. I scanned the trees, but saw nothing unusual. The trail soon became a faint dirt track, more a suggestion than a clear path. I had to push aside branches and step carefully over roots and rocks. My boots sank slightly into patches of damp earth, and the sound of running water grew louder ahead. The creek I had passed earlier must have curved back somehow, or maybe there was a small tributary. I welcomed the sound. Water meant I was near a natural landmark. Suddenly, I noticed the trail was gone altogether. The trees closed in, thick and tall, and the ground was uneven, littered with sticks and dead leaves. I stopped, heart beating faster now. The map was useless here, the compass only showing north, but no clear path. I felt a prickle of anxiety, the kind that comes when something small is off and you can't quite put your finger on it. I took a deep breath and decided to head toward the creek, hoping to find a trail or at least some sign of human passage. Moving carefully downhill, I could hear the water more clearly. Then I saw it. A thin, broken branch on the ground, snapped at an unnatural angle. Nearby, faint footprints in the mud. Too small to be from a deer, too human in shape and size. My pulse quickened. I had heard stories about hikers getting lost in these woods, sometimes running into trouble with hunters or worse. I wasn't sure who or what had left those prints, but I felt exposed and watched. I scanned the area again, my eyes searching for movement, but there was nothing but trees and shadows. I kept moving along the creek bank, hoping to find a clearing or a trail marker. The terrain grew rougher, steeper slopes, loose rocks, and wet moss making every step risky. My legs ached, and sweat trickled down my back despite the cool air. The sun had climbed higher and now beat through gaps in the canopy, creating spots of harsh light and deep shadows on the ground. Then, I heard it, a sudden crack of a branch breaking somewhere ahead, maybe 100 feet away. I froze, straining to listen. My breath came in short bursts, ears focused. The sound came again, faint but deliberate. Not an animal, I was sure. Something bigger, something moving with purpose. I debated whether to call out, but the silence around me swallowed my voice whole. No echoes, no replies. My stomach churned. The forest that had once felt like a peaceful sanctuary now felt like a trap. The shadows seemed to deepen, the air heavier. I started moving again, faster this time, sticking close to the creek. The trail had to be nearby. I remembered seeing a ranger station marked on the map a few miles downriver. If I could just reach the water, I might be able to follow it out to safety. But the forest resisted. Thick vines snagged my pack, thorny bushes scratched my arms, and the slope was slippery. As I rounded a bend, my foot caught on a root and I stumbled, falling hard onto the wet ground. My palms and knees scraped against sharp stones and dirt, pain flaring in my wrists. I sat up quickly, eyes darting around, feeling the sharp sting of the fall and a sudden surge of panic. The broken branch snaps were closer now, definitely following. I scrambled to my feet and started running, the creek roaring louder in my ears. I didn't look back, but I could feel a presence behind me, something moving fast, not animal, not human in any friendly way. I pressed on, heart pounding, lungs burning with effort. Then, the unexpected happened. The creek opened into a small clearing, bathed in sunlight. At the far edge stood an old wooden bridge, weathered and creaky, crossing to a dirt road I recognized from the map. Relief surged through me like a wave. I broke into a sprint, crossing the bridge carefully, the wood groaning beneath my weight. On the other side, the dirt road stretched out, disappearing into the trees. I could see tire tracks and a faint dust trail, evidence of recent use. Without hesitation, I started walking down the road, calling out in a low voice, hoping someone would hear me. Minutes later, I spotted a pickup truck parked near a small clearing. The door was open, keys hanging in the ignition. I climbed inside, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I pulled onto the road, I looked back toward the woods. The shadows seemed to watch me, but I was safe now, out of their reach. The truck rattled over gravel as I drove toward the ranger station. My hands trembled on the wheel, adrenaline still coursing through my veins. When I finally reached the station, a ranger greeted me with a puzzled look, but I was too exhausted to explain everything right away. Over the next hours, I learned that the area I had wandered into was known for illegal hunting and poaching, and some groups didn't take kindly to strangers. The footprints and noises I had heard were likely from those people, moving through the forest with intent to keep their activities hidden. I had been lucky to stumble out where I did, where the road provided an escape route. Back at my cabin, the sun was setting, painting the sky in deep reds and purples. I unpacked my gear slowly, still shaken but grateful. The forest was beautiful and wild, but it held dangers beyond the animals and terrain. Dangers from other humans who viewed it as their secret domain. I promised myself I would respect those boundaries next time and never underestimate how quickly a peaceful hike could turn into a fight for survival. I slept deeply that night, the woods quiet outside my window, but my mind alert. The forest was a place of solitude and beauty, yes, but also a place where caution was more than wisdom. It was survival. And I had learned that lesson the hard way. The morning air was crisp as I tightened the straps on my backpack, the scent of pine thick around me. The trailhead was quiet, save for the faint rustle of leaves stirred by a soft breeze. The forest stretched out ahead, a vast tangle of green and brown shadows, promising solitude and a challenge. I had planned this hike for weeks, a solo trek deep into the woods, away from the noise of the city, away from people. I wanted nothing but the sounds of my own footsteps, the snap of twigs, and the occasional call of birds. It was supposed to be a simple weekend escape, nothing more. The first few miles were easy, the path well-worn and gentle. I moved steadily, the soft crunch of dirt and leaves beneath my boots keeping rhythm with my breath. Early sunlight filtered through the canopy, casting dappled patterns on the ground. I stopped occasionally to drink water or adjust my gear, admiring the way the forest held its quiet, endless watch. The trail wound alongside a narrow creek, the water bubbling clear and cold over rounded stones. The smell of wet earth was rich, grounding me even as my legs grew tired. As the day stretched on, the terrain grew steeper and rougher. The trees thickened, their branches twisting into darker shapes overhead. The trail narrowed, and roots snaked across the path like veins. My boots snagged on one, sending me off balance for a moment. The forest seemed to close in, sounds muffled beneath the weight of thick leaves and damp air. The silence pressed around me like a heavy blanket, making every small noise, a twig breaking, a bird flitting through the trees, feel suddenly loud and sharp. I kept moving, knowing the campground I planned to reach was still a few hours ahead. The sun sank lower, slipping toward the horizon, turning the sky a fading orange. I could feel the temperature drop already, the forest shifting from warm and welcoming to cool and watchful. My breath came out in little puffs, the chill creeping into my bones. My pack felt heavier now, weighed down by the food and water I carried, but I pushed forward, eager to find the clearing where I would set up camp. When I finally broke through the trees, the sight was both comforting and unsettling. The clearing was a small pocket of open sky and dry grass surrounded by dense woods on all sides. I could see my breath in the cold air as I set down my pack, the weight lifting off my shoulders with a sigh. I gathered firewood carefully, choosing dry sticks hidden beneath fallen leaves. The forest was full of moisture, but in the clearing the wood crackled as I struck a match. Flames licked upward, casting flickering light over the rough stones I arranged for a fire ring. I ate quietly, savoring the warmth and the soft glow. The sky darkened to a deep blue, stars beginning to prick the blackness overhead. No city lights, no hum of distant cars, just the night and the forest. I lay back against a log, watching the fire burn low, feeling a strange mix of peace and unease settle in my chest. There was something about being this alone, so far from anyone else, that pulled at a part of me I didn't often visit. That unease didn't go away when the fire was just embers and I crawled into my tent. The nylon walls fluttered softly in the night breeze, and the forest pressed close around me like a silent, waiting thing. I listened to the sounds outside, branches swaying, the occasional rustle of small animals, the distant hoot of an owl. But there was another noise, something softer and more deliberate. I couldn't place it at first. Maybe the wind playing tricks, or my mind catching shadows in the dark. Sleep came in fits, never deep or easy. Every creak or snap made me tense, heart thudding in my chest. I kept my flashlight close, the beam slicing through the black when I dared to look outside. The trees swayed but stayed where they were, nothing more than shapes and shadows. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't quite alone. Morning came slow and gray, the sky thick with low clouds that muted the light. I packed up quickly, eager to leave the clearing behind and get back on the trail. The forest seemed heavier now, damp with mist that clung to my clothes and skin. The path was slippery from overnight rain, roots slick and rocks slicker. Every step needed care, every move cautious. I wasn't in a rush. The memory of the night kept my senses sharp. Hours passed, the trail leading deeper into the woods and higher into rougher terrain. The trees thinned out, replaced by rocky outcrops and sparse brush. I stopped at a ridge to catch my breath, the valley stretching wide below, cloaked in fog that shifted slowly like smoke. The wind picked up, cold and sharp, carrying the scent of pine and something else. Something faint, metallic and sour. I frowned, scanning the ground. There were dark stains on the rocks, too dark and deep to be just wet earth. The feeling of unease crept back stronger than before. I told myself it was just old rust or iron deposits in the soil, but my steps slowed, eyes darting to shadows and shapes in the brush. I kept moving, but the forest seemed to shift, every sound sharper, every movement unexpected. I caught glimpses of something in the corner of my vision, always gone when I turned to look. Footsteps, maybe, or something else. As the afternoon waned, the trail forked unexpectedly. I hadn't expected this, but the map showed a loop that reconnected a few miles ahead. I chose the left path, less worn and tangled with undergrowth. Felt wrong, but I pushed on. The trees grew closer again, branches scraping my jacket as I ducked under. The air thickened with humidity, and the forest floor was littered with broken branches and crushed leaves, as if something large had passed recently. My heart quickened when I spotted fresh footprints in the mud, too large to be mine, and not like any animal I knew. They were deep, heavy, and scattered, like someone had hurried through here. There was no sign of a campsite or any other hikers. The trail grew narrower, harder to follow. I debated turning back, but the sky was fading, and I didn't want to get lost in the dark. My phone had no signal, so no way to call for help if I needed it. The only sound was my breathing and the occasional distant crack of a branch. Then I heard it, a low, rhythmic thudding coming from somewhere ahead. I froze, straining to listen. It wasn't animal or human in a way I could place. It was steady and deliberate. My mind raced through possibilities. Could it be a logging machine? No, the forest was protected here. A hunter? But hunting season was over. The sound grew closer as I moved forward cautiously, stepping carefully over roots and rocks. I wanted to see what it was, but also wanted to stay hidden. Then I stumbled into a small clearing, the ground muddy and churned up. There, half buried under leaves, were rusted tools, a broken axe, a rusted saw. The noise stopped suddenly. I stood frozen, the hair on my neck prickling. Then I saw it. Fresh tracks leading away from the clearing, deeper into the woods. They were big, the kind that didn't belong to any animal. My gut twisted with fear, but I forced myself to follow. I had no choice, the trail was gone, and I had to find the main path again. The forest grew darker, the thick canopy blotting out what little light remained. My steps echoed hollowly, the silence pressing hard. The air smelled of damp earth and old leaves, but beneath it was that sour metallic scent again. I kept moving, heart pounding with each step, until the ground beneath me suddenly gave way. I fell hard onto a pile of loose rocks and dirt, twisting my ankle painfully. The fall knocked the breath out of me, and I lay there for a moment, chest heaving. The pain was sharp but not unbearable. I pushed myself up slowly, testing my weight on the ankle. It held, though weakly. I needed to move, needed to get out of there. As I scrambled to my feet, I looked down and saw the edge of a shallow pit, no more than a few feet deep, dug into the earth and hidden beneath leaves and branches. That explained the fall. Someone had dug a trap, maybe to catch animals or worse. My skin crawled as I realized how close I had come to stepping into it fully. With great care, I edged away from the pit and followed the footprints, which now seemed to lead away in no clear direction. The forest closed in tighter still. I kept my eyes open for any sign of the main trail, my pack heavier and my ankle throbbing with every step. Suddenly, the ground beneath me softened again, and I almost slipped into another pit, this one cleverly camouflaged with moss and twigs. My breath caught in my throat. Whoever had made these traps was still close, watching. The thought chilled me more than the cold wind ever could. I forced myself to move on, limping along as best as I could. The sun had set completely now, leaving only a faint afterglow on the horizon. The forest was alive with sounds. Insects buzzing, leaves rustling, something moving just beyond sight. Every shadow looked like a threat. Then, through the gloom, I spotted a faint line of light filtering between the trees. Hope surged through me. The early morning air was crisp and fresh, a gentle chill that promised the start of a good day for hiking. I had been looking forward to this weekend for weeks. My plan was simple: drive out to the nearby national forest, hike a trail I had never been on before, and spend a night under the stars. The forest was well known, but I chose a less traveled path, a winding route that snaked through dense woods, rocky hills, and narrow streams. The trail was marked on the map as Blue Ridge Loop, about 12 miles long, promising both challenge and solitude. I started just after sunrise, the sun casting long shadows between the trees. The forest was quiet except for the occasional chirp of birds or the rustling of small animals in the underbrush. The smell of pine and damp earth was strong, and I breathed it in deeply as I stepped along the narrow dirt path. The ground was soft in places, scattered with fallen leaves and small twigs that cracked softly beneath my boots. The air was dry but cool, the kind of temperature that made me glad I had packed light layers. At first, the trail was easy, gently sloping and lined with tall pines and oaks. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, making patterns of light and shadow on the ground. I could hear the faint sound of a stream nearby, water trickling over rocks. Every now and then, I stopped to look around or take a sip of water. I was carrying a backpack with basic supplies, some food, water, a first aid kit, a flashlight, and an old map I'd printed from a website. I didn't expect trouble. I was confident in my skills and the route. The first few miles passed without incident. I saw a few other hikers, but mostly kept to myself. The trail grew steeper as it wound up the side of a ridge. The trees thinned, replaced by thick bushes and patches of bare rock. From a high point, I stopped to look back. The forest stretched out below me in a sea of green, the morning sun sparkling off the tops of distant trees. It felt good to be out here, away from the noise and busy streets. As I moved forward, the trail began to change. The dirt path gave way to rougher ground, roots and rocks making each step more careful. I kept my pace steady, careful not to slip. The sound of the stream was gone now, replaced by a quiet hum of wind through the branches. The air smelled different here, heavier with moss and wet stone. I noticed the sky had started to cloud over, soft gray clouds drifting low between the trees. By midday, I had covered about 7 miles. I found a small clearing beside a narrow creek, shaded by thick maple trees. I sat down on a fallen log and took a break, pulling out a sandwich and some nuts. The creek bubbled over smooth stones, clear water rushing in little splashes. Around me, the forest was still and peaceful, but I couldn't shake a feeling that something was off. It was subtle, a strange silence, maybe, or the way the trees seemed too close, closing in like walls. After eating, I packed up and checked my map. The trail ahead was supposed to loop around a small hill, then drop down to the valley floor where I could find a campsite. The weather looked like it might turn bad soon, but I figured I had plenty of time. I should be there by late afternoon. The next part of the trail was tougher. The path was narrower and less clear, the marks on the trees faded or missing in places. I had to watch closely to avoid losing my way. The ground was uneven and slick from recent rain, muddy in spots. At one point, I slipped on a moss-covered rock and caught myself just in time. My hands were dirty and scratched from brushing against thorny bushes. The forest here was dense. The trees were tall, their branches tangled together, making the light dim even in the afternoon. The air was damp and cool, with a faint smell of decay. The sound of birds had all but disappeared. Instead, I heard the occasional crack of a branch breaking underfoot or the distant caw of a crow. My breathing was steady, but my heart felt heavier with each step. About 3 miles from the clearing, I came to a fork in the trail. The map showed 2 possible routes. One was marked steep ascent, the other valley descent. The ascent looked shorter but harder. The valley route was longer but easier. I decided to take the valley, thinking it would be better for my energy and safer in case the weather worsened. The path wound down sharply through thick underbrush. I had to duck under branches and step over fallen logs. The ground was wet and slippery, and the sky had turned a deep gray, heavy with clouds. A low rumble of thunder echoed in the distance. I picked up my pace, eager to reach the campsite before the rain started. Then it began. A slow drizzle at first, then steady rain falling through the canopy in drops and sheets. The leaves and branches dripped water, soaking my jacket and pants. The mud deepened, making my boots heavy and my footing uncertain. I kept moving, trying to keep calm, but the trail became harder to follow. The forest seemed darker, the rain dulling colors and sound. At one point, the path disappeared entirely beneath a small landslide. A mass of wet earth, broken branches, and stones blocked the way. I could see no way around without climbing dangerously steep slopes covered in loose rock. I was trapped between the mudslide and thick forest on either side. My map showed no alternate paths here. I sat on a large rock, wet and cold, trying to think. I still had some daylight, but not much. My phone was in my backpack, but the battery was low and there was no signal. The rain was coming down harder now, and the air was chilling me. I pulled on my rain jacket's hood and looked around. The forest felt closed in, the trees tall and dark against the gray sky. I decided to backtrack a little, hoping to find the fork again and maybe take the steep ascent route instead. It was harder, but safer than wandering off-trail in the rain. I turned and carefully climbed back up the slippery path, my boots sinking into the mud. After what felt like an hour, I reached the fork. The trail to the steep ascent was nearly invisible, overgrown with bushes and fallen branches. The rain had soaked everything, and my hands were cold and numb as I pushed aside leaves and vines. I started up, gripping tree trunks and rocks to steady myself. The climb was brutal. The ground was slick and uneven, sharp stones cutting into my boots. My muscles burned with effort, and I felt the cold seep deep into my bones. Rain hammered down, soaking me through. The trees thinned as I gained height, replaced by bare rock and thorny bushes. The wind picked up, whipping rain into my face. Near the top, I slipped on a mossy patch and fell hard against a jagged stone. Pain shot through my leg and arm. I stayed still for a moment, breathing hard, trying to judge the damage. My arm was scraped and bleeding, and my leg ached sharply. I tested my weight on the leg. It hurt, but I could still stand. I wrapped a torn piece of my shirt around the bleeding cut and forced myself up. The summit was a rocky ridge with a small outcrop overlooking the forest below. I stopped there, shivering and soaked. The wind was cold and fierce, and the rain slowed to a mist. I looked out over the endless trees, gray and heavy under the storm clouds. I checked my map again. The trail was supposed to descend from here toward the campsite, but the path was faint and barely visible. I didn't want to risk losing the trail in this weather, so I decided to stay put until the storm passed. I found a small cave-like hollow in the rocks, just big enough to sit in and shelter from the wind. I settled down, pulling my jacket tight around me and trying to warm up. The pain in my leg was sharp, but I forced myself to keep moving it to avoid stiffness. My thoughts raced. I hadn't told anyone exactly where I was going, and my phone had no signal. I was alone, wet, hurt, and stuck in a storm on a rocky ridge far from the road. Night fell slowly as the storm eased. The rain stopped completely, but the sky stayed cloudy and dark. I wrapped myself in my sleeping bag, hoping to rest and gather strength for the hike out in the morning. Sleep came in short bursts. The cold and pain kept me awake most of the night. I listened to the sound of wind through the trees and the occasional drop of water falling from rocks. I felt completely alone in the vast forest, vulnerable and small. Morning brought a weak, gray light. The clouds were breaking up, and the air was still cool but calmer. I packed up slowly, stiff and sore, but determined to get down the mountain. The trail was muddy and rough, but easier now that it was dry. I took careful steps down the slope, using trees and rocks for support. My leg was painful but held. After a long, slow descent, I reached the creek where I had rested the day before. The water was clear and cold, and I drank deeply. I checked my map and saw the trail led from here back to the parking lot about 5 miles away. The walk back was tiring but steady. The forest seemed friendlier in the soft daylight, the trees alive with birdsong and movement. I kept a steady pace, stopping only to rest briefly or eat a snack. My body ached, but I felt stronger with every step. After several hours, It started as a simple plan. A solo hike through a well-known stretch of forest that ran along the ridge of a mountain in a region I had never explored before. I had read about it in some hiking forums, seen pictures online, and decided it would be a good challenge. Nothing fancy or extreme, just a day hike through rugged terrain, with the promise of some great views and the quiet company of nature. I was feeling good about it, prepared with my pack, water, snacks, map, and basic first aid kit. The weather was clear and warm, perfect for hiking. I left early in the morning, driving to the trailhead which sat near a small town that seemed sleepy even at 8 a.m. The parking lot was almost empty, except for a couple of other cars, which gave me a quiet feeling of solitude without complete isolation. I double-checked my gear, strapped on my backpack, and stepped onto the trail just as the sun peeked over the trees, casting long shadows on the dirt path. The trail itself was not difficult at first. It wound through dense pine woods, the needles soft underfoot, mixed with patches of dry leaves and small stones. Birds were active, calling out here and there, and the occasional squirrel darted across the path. The air smelled fresh, piney, with a hint of damp earth. I took my time, moving steadily but not rushing, enjoying the quiet and the sounds of the forest. As the morning passed, the trail began to climb more steeply. The ground became rocky in places, and roots stretched across the path like natural hurdles. I stopped to rest a few times, drinking water and eating some trail mix to keep my energy up. The sunlight filtered through the canopy in bright patches, warming the cool mountain air. I could hear the distant rush of a creek, which made me look forward to the next resting spot. After about 3 hours, I reached a small clearing where the trail crossed a narrow creek. The water was clear and cold, tumbling over smooth stones with a gentle roar. I knelt to splash some water on my face, feeling the coldness shock me awake. The sun was higher now, making the air warmer. I took out my map to check my progress, noting that I was just past the halfway point for my planned route. Up to this point, the hike had been peaceful and pleasant, just as I expected. I continued along the trail, which now followed the ridgeline. The trees thinned out a little, revealing glimpses of the valley below. The wind picked up, cool and steady, brushing against my skin and rustling the leaves. I stopped often to look out over the vast forest stretching away in every direction, a sea of green under the blue sky. It was a quiet, perfect moment, the kind of experience that makes all the effort worthwhile. But as I kept walking, something began to feel off. I can't say exactly when it started. Maybe it was the way the wind shifted, or the way the shadows grew longer and darker despite the sun still being high. The trail began to get rougher, less well-maintained. Branches and thorny bushes reached across the path, and patches of wet mud made footing slippery. I had to watch my step more carefully, moving slower. At one point, I thought I saw a figure out of the corner of my eye, something tall standing just behind a cluster of trees. I spun around quickly, heart beating faster, but there was nothing there. Just the trees, swaying gently in the breeze. I told myself it was just a trick of light and shadow, or maybe my imagination playing games. After all, it was getting late in the afternoon, and my body was tired. The forest here felt thicker, darker. The trail grew narrower and less distinct, almost disappearing under leaves and fallen branches. I checked my map again, but the terrain on the paper seemed vague, and I wasn't sure if I was still on the main path or had wandered off. The trees were all the same, tall pines and oaks, dense and uninviting. I stopped and took out my compass. It confirmed I was heading the right direction roughly, but the landscape offered no familiar landmarks to guide me. My phone had no signal, so I couldn't check GPS or call for help. I felt a tight knot in my stomach. I wasn't lost yet, but I could see how easy it might happen here. Deciding to press on, I moved more carefully. The sun began its slow descent, and the forest started to dim. The shadows stretched and deepened, and the cool air turned colder. My steps echoed oddly in the silence, and the feeling of isolation grew stronger. Then I heard it, a soft, rhythmic snapping sound, like someone stepping on dry twigs. It was faint, but definitely there. I stopped moving and listened. The snapping came again, closer this time. I looked around, but the trees were still. No animals moved, no birds called. Only the sound of breaking twigs. I felt a surge of panic, but kept calm. Maybe it was another hiker or a hunter out here. I called out softly, but my voice was swallowed by the dense woods. No answer. The snapping stopped abruptly. I took a deep breath and quickened my pace, hoping to put some distance between me and whatever was making the noise. But then I heard it again, footsteps now clearly following me, keeping pace with mine. I glanced behind but saw only shadows and trees. My heart pounded harder. I didn't want to run, afraid of tripping on the rough terrain, but I needed to get out of here. I kept moving faster, ears straining for any other sounds. The footsteps kept matching mine, never speeding up, never slowing. At one point, I veered off the trail to the side, hoping to lose whoever was behind me by hiding behind a thick tree trunk. I crouched low, breath shallow, and waited. The footsteps came into the clearing but stopped. I heard nothing else. No voices, no rustling in the bushes. Minutes passed like hours. Finally, I didn't hear the footsteps anymore. I stayed still for a while longer before cautiously standing and moving again. This time, I stayed as close to the trail as I could, watching my back constantly. The sun was nearly gone when I reached a fork in the path. The map was no help. Both routes looked the same on paper, and without landmarks I had no clue which way to go. I thought about staying put until daylight, but the thought of spending the night out here alone and unprepared was worse. I chose the right fork, hoping it would lead down the mountain faster. The trail descended steeply, and my legs burned from the effort. The darkness thickened around me, and I pulled out my flashlight, the beam cutting a narrow path through the trees. Every sound seemed amplified now, the rustle of leaves, the snap of a branch, the distant call of an owl. I kept reminding myself to stay calm, slow my breathing, and focus on each step. About an hour later, I finally heard something that lifted my spirits, the faint roar of a road. Encouraged, I pushed harder, navigating the rough slope with growing urgency. Soon, the trees thinned, and I emerged onto a dirt service road cutting through the forest. I followed the road downhill, my legs trembling but moving steadily. After another 20 minutes, I saw lights ahead, headlights actually. A small clearing opened up, and I realized I was near a ranger station or some kind of park building. I approached cautiously, relief washing over me. The doors were locked, but a vehicle was parked nearby, and lights shone from inside. I banged on the door and shouted until finally a park ranger appeared, surprised but helpful. I explained my situation, that I had gotten lost and felt like I was being followed. The ranger nodded seriously and radioed for backup. He said the area was known for hikers wandering off the trail and that people had reported strange sightings and sounds recently, probably just hunters or hikers making noise. I was driven back to the trailhead, where my car still sat waiting. The night sky was clear and full of stars, and I sat in the driver's seat for a long time before starting the engine, feeling safe but exhausted. That night, in my bed, I thought about the day, how easily I had lost my way, how real the fear was when I thought someone was following me, and how lucky I was to find help before things got worse. I knew I'd hike again, but I'd be more careful, more prepared. Nature was beautiful and peaceful, but it was also unpredictable and, sometimes, dangerous. The forest had tested me, and I had made it through, clear-headed and alive. I never saw who or what had been behind me in those woods, but maybe it didn't matter. Sometimes the scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters, but just the feeling of being truly alone, vulnerable, and lost in a place where the world you know fades away. And that was enough. The sun had barely started to rise when I pulled on my boots and stepped outside my small cabin. The air was crisp, fresh, and smelled like pine and earth. It was the perfect morning to go hiking, and I had planned this trip for weeks. A solo hike deep into the forest on a trail I had never taken before. I needed the break from city life, the quiet, the stillness, and the chance to be alone with nature. I packed my backpack carefully the night before. Water, some energy bars, a map, a compass, a first aid kit, a flashlight, a lighter, and a small knife. I made sure my phone was fully charged, though I didn't expect much signal once I got far into the woods. The plan was simple. Follow the trail marked on the map for about 6 miles, reach a small clearing with a stream, rest there, then turn back before dark. Nothing complicated. I like to keep things straightforward when I hiked alone. The trailhead was just a short drive from the cabin. I parked my car, grabbed my pack, and started walking. The path was narrow and covered with a thick layer of fallen leaves from last autumn. The trees around me were tall and close, their trunks thick and rough, the branches mostly bare, though some still held onto stubborn patches of yellow and red leaves. The forest was quiet, except for the occasional bird call and the crunch of my boots on the leaves. At first, the hike felt easy. The path was mostly flat, winding gently along the side of a hill. I passed moss-covered rocks, small patches of wildflowers, and little streams crossing under wooden bridges. The sunlight filtered through the branches, casting a soft, warm glow. The air smelled like damp soil and pine needles, a smell I always found comforting. As I walked, I noticed small signs of wildlife. A squirrel darting up a tree, a rabbit disappearing into the underbrush, fresh deer tracks in the mud. I felt calm, peaceful, and a little bit alive in a way I hadn't felt in weeks. About 2 miles in, the trail started to get rougher. The ground rose sharply, and the path became rocky and uneven. I had to watch my step carefully to avoid twisting an ankle. The trees grew even thicker here, making the forest darker and cooler. The air felt heavier, too, like the forest was holding its breath. I stopped to take a drink from my water bottle and looked around. There was no one else here, no sign of other hikers or campers. Just me and the forest. I liked the solitude but also felt a flicker of caution. I reminded myself to stick to the trail and not wander off. After another hour, I reached a fork in the path. My map showed that the right fork led to the clearing I wanted, while the left went deeper into the forest and eventually looped back. I took the right path. This part of the trail was narrow and overgrown. Branches brushed my arms and face, and I had to step over fallen logs. The ground was uneven, and the forest grew darker with every step. I noticed how quiet it had become. No birds, no animals. The silence was almost too complete, as if something had left the forest empty. Suddenly, I heard a sound ahead, a rustling, like something moving through the bushes. I froze, heart pounding. I scanned the area but saw nothing. It was probably just a deer or some other animal. I told myself that as I kept walking, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I moved faster now, eager to reach the clearing. The trail twisted sharply, and I had to hold onto tree roots to keep my balance. My legs were starting to ache, but I pushed on. After another 15 minutes, I finally broke through the trees and stepped into the clearing. The sight was beautiful. A small stream ran through the center, its water clear and cold. The grass around it was green and soft, with wildflowers growing near the edges. The sun shone down on the open space, making everything sparkle. I took a deep breath, feeling relief flood through me. I sat down by the stream and pulled out my water and food. As I ate, I listened to the gentle sound of the water flowing over rocks. The forest around the clearing was thick, and I could hear the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. After a while, I decided to explore the area around the clearing a little. I walked along the stream, careful not to slip on the wet stones. The water was so clear I could see small fish darting under the surface. The forest beyond the clearing looked dense and wild. I felt a strange sense of unease creeping back in. Something about this place didn't feel right. The forest seemed too quiet, too still. No birds sang here, no animals moved. The silence felt heavy, almost unnatural. I checked my watch. It was already mid-afternoon. I needed to start heading back soon to avoid being caught out after dark. As I turned to go, I noticed something unusual. Near the edge of the clearing, partially hidden under leaves and dirt, was a piece of old, torn fabric. It looked like part of a shirt or jacket, faded and stained. I crouched down to look closer. There was something else. A small, rusted metal object, half buried beside the fabric. I dug it out carefully. It was a pocket knife, old and worn, the blade chipped but still sharp. The handle had initials carved into it, but I couldn't make them out clearly. A chill ran down my spine. Why was this here? Who had left it? And why didn't I see any signs of a camp or fire nearby? I put the knife and fabric back where I found them, deciding not to take them with me. I didn't want to disturb anything, but the feeling of unease deepened. I started walking back along the trail, trying to ignore the quiet. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees casting long shadows in the late afternoon sun. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made me jump. About 20 minutes into the hike back, I heard something again. This time it was closer, a soft crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. I stopped and listened. The sound stopped too. I looked around, but the forest was still. No movement, no sign of anyone or anything. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst. I told myself to stay calm. Maybe it was just an animal or my imagination. I picked up my pace, eager to reach the fork and get back to the easier path. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A figure, tall and thin, standing just beyond a tree. It was too still to be an animal, and the shape looked human. I froze. The figure didn't move or make a sound, just stood there watching me. Panic surged through me. I didn't know who or what this was, but I knew I needed to get out. I turned and ran back the way I came, my boots pounding on the rocky trail, heart in my throat. Branches whipped against my face and arms. My breath came in sharp gasps. I didn't look back. The trail became steeper and I stumbled several times. I scrambled over rocks and roots, adrenaline carrying me faster than I expected. When I finally reached the fork, I took the left path without hesitation. It was longer, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get away from that clearing and the figure. The left trail led me down the hill, twisting through the thick forest. My legs were burning, but I kept moving. The forest here was darker and damper, with moss hanging from branches and the smell of decay in the air. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure following me. But there was nothing. After what felt like hours, the trail opened up into a wider dirt road, the one I had driven in on. Relief washed over me like a wave. I ran down the road until I saw my car parked at the edge of the trees. I slammed the door shut behind me and locked it. For a moment, I just sat there, breathing hard, hands shaking. I looked at my phone. No signal. Of course. I started the engine and drove away, the forest disappearing in the rearview mirror. Once I was back in town, in a place with people and lights and noise, I thought about what had happened. The figure, the knife and torn fabric, the eerie silence. It didn't make sense. There was no trail sign of recent visitors near the clearing, no campsite or footprints. Whoever or whatever was there had been careful not to leave much behind. I told myself it was probably someone living rough, maybe a hunter or someone hiding out in the woods. The forest could be unforgiving, and not everyone who came here did so with good intentions. I decided to report what I found to the local ranger station the next day: the knife, the fabric, and the strange figure I had seen. Maybe someone was missing or lost. Maybe the forest held more secrets than I had realized. But for me, that hike was over. I learned that the woods are beautiful, but they can also be dangerous. And sometimes, when you go far enough, you might find things you don't want to see. From then on, I stuck to well-known trails and never went hiking alone in the deep forest again. The peace I once found there was replaced by caution and respect for the unknown. That day taught me that nature isn't just a place for adventure and beauty. It can also be a place where people's stories and secrets linger, hidden beneath the trees and shadows. And sometimes, it's better to leave those stories undisturbed. The trail started early in the morning, before the sun was fully up. I had planned this hike for weeks, a solo trip through the deep woods of the Appalachian Range. I was carrying my pack with everything I needed: water, food, a small tent, some warm clothes, a first aid kit, and a good map. I had checked the weather forecast the day before, and it promised a clear weekend with no rain, cool temperatures, and light winds. Perfect hiking conditions. The first few miles went well. The path was narrow and winding, covered with pine needles and patches of soft moss. The air was fresh, smelling of damp earth and pine resin. I could hear the distant call of birds waking up, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Occasionally, I passed by rocky outcrops where the trees opened up just enough to give a clear view of the valley below. I stopped a few times to catch my breath, drink water, and take pictures of the landscape. As the morning moved on, the trail became steeper. I was climbing a ridge, and the sun was now rising higher, casting long shadows through the trees. The forest was dense, mostly hardwoods and some evergreens. The ground beneath my feet was uneven, with roots and loose stones making each step a bit tricky. I paid close attention to my footing, making sure not to twist an ankle or slip. Around midday, I reached a small clearing. I sat down on a fallen log to eat some lunch: peanut butter sandwiches, a handful of trail mix, and an apple. The clearing was quiet except for the sounds of the forest. The sun shone through gaps in the canopy, warming the open space. I looked at my map and noticed that the trail ahead was supposed to circle around the ridge and then descend into a small valley. From there, it would follow a creek back towards the parking area where I left my car. I packed up and continued. The trail began to descend gradually, winding through thick underbrush and patches of ferns. The air was cooler here, shaded by the tall trees. Occasionally, the path crossed over small streams, where I paused to drink some water and splash my face to stay fresh. The sound of running water was calming, but also made me more alert, knowing that water attracts wildlife and sometimes people. About 3 hours into the hike, I came to a fork in the trail. According to the map, the right path was the main trail, well marked and used often, leading directly to the creek and then back to the parking lot. The left path was marked as a shortcut, a less maintained route that would save about 2 miles. I looked down the left path. It was narrower, overgrown with bushes, and the trees leaned in close overhead. It didn't look inviting, but I was feeling good and confident, so I decided to take it. At first, the shortcut was manageable. The path was rough but passable. I had to duck under low branches and step over fallen logs. The trail twisted and turned, sometimes losing the clear markings, but I followed the faint blazes on trees. About 30 minutes in, I realized that the shortcut was longer and tougher than I expected. The path climbed again sharply, and the ground was covered with loose rocks that made climbing difficult. My legs burned, and I slowed down to catch my breath. Suddenly, I noticed something odd. The trail seemed to disappear ahead. I stopped and looked around. The trees here were older, the forest thicker, with thick layers of fallen leaves and branches covering the ground. The faint blazes were gone. I looked back, and the trail behind me was faint but still visible. I took a few steps forward, trying to find any sign of the path. Nothing. The underbrush was thick, and it felt like I was standing in the middle of a dense forest with no clear way out. I pulled out my map and compass. According to the map, I should be heading slightly downhill and northeast, but the trees all looked the same. I turned on my phone's GPS. No signal. Of course, this part of the forest was too deep for reception. I put the phone away, feeling a little uneasy. I was alone, off the main trail and possibly lost. I sat down on a rock to think. I remembered my survival training and tried to stay calm. The sun was still high enough in the sky to give me some daylight. I decided to backtrack carefully to the last point where the trail was visible. I marked that spot mentally, knowing that if things got worse, I could try to stay there and wait for help. As I turned around, I noticed something else. A faint smell, not like the usual forest smells. It was more like smoke, a burnt smell, but very faint. I looked around but saw no signs of fire or smoke. Shrugging it off as probably a campfire from earlier in the week, I focused on finding the trail. The climb back was slow and careful. I used my hiking pole to test the ground ahead, pushing aside branches and making sure the rocks were steady. Eventually, I found the blaze marks again and followed them downhill. Relief washed over me as the path became clearer and the trees started to thin. About half an hour later, the trail opened up to a small creek crossing. The water was clear and cold, and I drank deeply. I felt a little more relaxed but still alert. The forest seemed to close back in around me, but the path was easy to follow. Then I heard a noise. Not animal noise, something heavier, slower, like footsteps, but not quite matching the sound of my own steps. My heart jumped. I stopped and listened hard. The noise stopped as soon as I stopped. I looked around carefully, trying to spot the source. The forest was thick, but the shadows didn't show any movement. I kept moving, faster now, glancing over my shoulder every few steps. The trail climbed slightly before descending again towards a wider clearing. I reached the clearing and stopped, breathing hard. The place looked familiar, but I couldn't place it on my map. That's when I saw it. An old abandoned cabin, partially hidden by vines and trees. It was made of rough wood, the roof sagging, windows broken. I hadn't seen it marked anywhere on the map. My mind raced. Could it be a hunter's cabin? A ranger's outpost? Or something else? Despite the unease, I walked closer, wanting to check it out in case I could find some clues about where I was. The door hung open, creaking slightly in the breeze. Inside, the floor was covered with leaves and debris. There was an old rusted stove, broken furniture, and scraps of paper scattered on a table. I searched the papers. Some looked like old notes, others maps. One of the maps showed the surrounding forest but included markings not on my map, including the cabin itself and paths leading deeper into the woods. I studied it carefully, noticing that some paths led to a road about 2 miles away. I felt a little hopeful. If I could find that road, I could get help or at least get back to a place with signal. I took a deep breath, stuffed the map into my jacket pocket, and stepped outside. The sun was starting to dip low in the sky. I had to move fast. I followed the path marked on the old map, pushing through thick brush and climbing small ridges. The forest was quieter now, the shadows longer and cooler. The air smelled damp and earthy. After an hour of hard walking, I finally saw a break in the trees. Through the branches, I could see a faint line of asphalt. An old, narrow road, cracked and overgrown, but unmistakably a road. I walked down to it and sat on the edge, exhausted but relieved. Pulling out my phone, I tried again. This time, a weak signal popped up. I quickly sent a message to a friend with my location, then waited, watching the road. About 20 minutes later, I heard a car approaching from the distance. A pickup truck rolled up slowly, dust rising from the gravel shoulder. The driver waved as they stopped. Relief flooded me. I climbed in, and they drove me back to the main highway and then to the nearest town. I was tired, hungry, but safe. Looking back at the forest as we drove away, I thought about how easy it had been to get lost, how important it was to stick to the main trail, and how lucky I was to find that cabin and the old map. The experience taught me a lot about respect for nature and preparation. Hiking alone was an adventure, but also a risk. Next time, I'd take more care, tell more people where I was going, and maybe bring a GPS device or extra maps. The forest was beautiful and wild, but it could also be unforgiving. I was glad to be back on solid ground, and I knew I'd never forget that hike. Not because it was scary or dangerous, but because it reminded me how important it is to be prepared, patient, and alert when venturing into the unknown. The sun was just beginning to rise when I started my hike, the air crisp and cool against my skin. I had planned this trip for weeks, a solo trek through the rugged wilderness of the Appalachian foothills. I wanted a break from the noise and stress of the city, to lose myself in the steady rhythm of walking and breathing in the quiet of the forest. The trailhead was easy to find, a small gravel parking lot surrounded by towering pines and hardwoods, the ground damp with early morning dew. My pack was heavy with essentials: water, snacks, a first aid kit, a map, and a flashlight, but I felt ready, eager to take on the challenge. The path ahead was narrow, winding through dense woods where the sun filtered down in long shafts of golden light. The air smelled rich and earthy, mixed with the scent of pine needles and wildflowers. Birds sang somewhere high in the canopy, their songs distant but clear. I stepped carefully over roots and stones, my boots crunching softly on the leaf litter. The forest was alive, but calm, as if it had been waiting just for me. I had chosen this trail because it promised both solitude and a good workout. Steep climbs, rocky scrambles, and some beautiful overlooks. I wanted to test myself, to push my limits a little. My plan was to hike deep into the woods, camp overnight near a small creek, then head back the next day. The weather forecast was clear, no rain expected, so I felt confident. As I walked, I kept an eye on the trail markers, bright orange rectangles painted on tree trunks, and checked my map often. The trail was well maintained but remote enough that I only passed a couple of other hikers in the early morning. Each time, I nodded politely but didn't stop to chat. I liked the silence too much. The climb began after the first 2 miles. The path narrowed, steepened, and the trees grew even taller and thicker. My legs burned as I pushed upward, using my trekking poles for balance. Sweat soaked my shirt, and my breath came in steady, controlled gasps. The higher I climbed, the cooler the air became, and the forest around me felt denser, darker. The sunlight barely touched the ground here, blocked by the thick canopy overhead. I reached the first overlook just before noon. The view opened wide to rolling hills covered in green and gold, stretching out under a blue sky dotted with fluffy clouds. I sat on a large rock and ate a small meal, a sandwich and some trail mix, savoring the quiet and the beauty. My water bottle was already half empty, so I made a mental note to refill soon. After a short break, I continued deeper into the forest. The trail twisted and turned, sometimes flat, sometimes rising again. The terrain grew more rugged, with loose rocks and fallen branches to navigate. I kept my eyes on the trail, alert for any signs of wildlife or hazards. Deer tracks crisscrossed the path, and I spotted a red fox slipping silently between the trees. The forest began to feel less familiar, even wild. The trees were older, the underbrush thicker. I noticed the occasional broken branch, the scrape of bark on a tree trunk. It was as if something had moved through here recently, something big. I tried not to let it worry me. I reminded myself that wildlife was normal, part of the wilderness experience. Still, a subtle unease crept in. My steps slowed, my senses sharpened. The wind shifted, carrying unfamiliar sounds, snapping twigs, rustling leaves. I stopped and listened, holding my breath. The forest seemed to hold its breath with me. The trail forked suddenly, and I stopped to check my map again. I was at a junction I hadn't expected. The markers here were faded, half hidden under moss and lichen. I knew which way to go but hesitated. The left path looked overgrown, less traveled. The right path seemed clearer but led away from my planned route. I chose the left, trusting my instincts. The underbrush closed in, thorny vines catching on my sleeves, branches scraping my face. The trail disappeared under fallen leaves and pine needles. My heart beat faster. I felt like I was walking into a part of the forest that didn't want to be disturbed. After about 20 minutes, I realized the trail had vanished completely. I was stepping blindly between trees, trying to follow faint signs. A broken twig here, a disturbed patch of earth there. My confidence faltered. I took out my compass and map again, trying to reorient myself. The sun was moving lower, and the shadows lengthened. I started to feel the weight of isolation settle heavily on me. No other hikers, no sounds except the occasional bird call and the crunch of my own footsteps. I realized I had no phone signal. My heart sank. I was truly alone, lost in the woods. I tried to calm down, told myself to think clearly. I had the gear I needed: water, food, a flashlight, a knife. I could stay safe. I decided to backtrack to the last recognizable point, then follow the main trail. But when I turned around, the forest looked different. Trees blocked my path, and the sun was dipping behind thick clouds. I pushed forward anyway, brushing aside branches, stepping over roots, trying to find the way. Time passed slowly. The sky darkened to a dull gray, and the wind picked up. It rattled through the branches, carrying the sharp scent of damp earth and pine sap. I felt the first drops of rain on my face and hurried to find shelter. There was no trail, no path, just dense forest. Then I heard it, a distant, irregular sound. Not natural. It was a low, rhythmic thumping, like heavy footsteps or something dragging. I froze. My breath caught. The sound came closer, mixed with cracking branches and leaves crunching underfoot. I scanned the trees but saw nothing. Panic surged. I knew the forest could be dangerous at night, with wild animals and rough terrain. But this sound was different. It was deliberate, something moving with purpose. I gripped my knife and flashlight, ready to defend myself if needed. I decided to climb a tree to get a better view. The bark was rough under my fingers, and the branches creaked as I pulled myself up. From here, I could see a small clearing. The thumping noise stopped suddenly. The forest fell silent again, except for the rain now falling steadily. I stayed in the tree for nearly an hour, shivering but alert. Finally, the rain eased, and the sky began to lighten. I climbed down carefully and decided to keep moving toward what I hoped was the trailhead. As I walked, I found signs of human presence. An old rusted can, a piece of torn cloth caught on a branch. The forest began to thin, and after a while, I spotted a narrow dirt road in the distance. Relief flooded me. I headed toward it, stumbling out of the trees and onto the road just as the sun rose fully. I followed the road down the hill until I reached a ranger station, where I found help and warmth. They called search and rescue, who later confirmed there had been reports of illegal activity in the woods I had wandered into. People setting traps, hiding from the law. The strange noises I heard were likely those individuals moving around. I was shaken but unharmed. The experience taught me to respect the wilderness even more and to always prepare for the unexpected. I never took another solo hike without telling someone exactly where I was going and carrying a GPS device. That trip stayed with me for years, a reminder that sometimes the scariest things aren't myths or monsters, but the real dangers hidden quietly in the wild places we think we know, and that survival depends on caution, calm, and respect for the unknown.